Chapter 366. If the heart was not at ease, how could the sword be at ease? Ding Ning did not look at Jing Liuli's expression, but looked down at the medicine pot. This was the true meaning of the great carefree sword. But the cultivators of the world, from the start of cultivation, naturally accepted the ideas passed down by countless ancient people and seniors. Imperceptibly, they had a fixed way of thinking that some things could be done and some could not be done. This was unconsciously restricting oneself from the start of cultivation. Without the true meaning, one could not reach that level. If one did not reach that level, one would not know where they had gone wrong. Huang Jinwei was not the only one who cherished talent. Jing Liuli had truly thought of Ding Ning as her teacher in this period of time. Ding Ning also intended to teach Jing Liuli. But how far Jing Liuli could go would depend on her own comprehension. Jing Liuli sensed something. She slowly bowed her head, calmed her emotions, and looked thoughtfully at the fire. The medicine in the medicine pot boiled continuously, turning from a faint blue-red color to a thick black. After an hour, the blue-red miasma shrouding the medicine pots completely dissipated. Ding Ning calmly poured the concoction from the 3 pots directly into a coarse sand teapot that was usually used for herbal tea. He took a small bowl, blew on the steam, and drank by himself as if he was drinking tea. As soon as the medicinal juice entered his stomach, his flesh and blood that came into contact with it instantly turned pitch black. The mixed and tyrannical medicinal power instantly sputtered out along his blood vessels like poison. Countless bright red blood vessels turned into black vines that continuously spread throughout his body. His originally fresh flesh and blood began to decay, like a bright flower withering in an instant. Even the surface of his beating heart had countless black threads. But in the next moment, countless invisible little silkworms slowly surged out of his body. With each mouthful of the thick medicine, the black medicine would enter his stomach from his throat. At the same time, countless black threads would spread through his body, and these invisible little silkworms would carefully swallow a mouthful. It was a strange frequency that no one could imagine. These countless little silkworms swallowed at the same time, swallowing the portion of the medicinal power that was truly harmful to the body of a cultivator, swallowing all of the medicinal liquid Ding Ning drank. Those black lines were still spreading throughout his body, but they had already turned into extremely pure medicinal power. His decaying flesh and blood began to glow with vitality once again, bursting forth with even more astonishing vitality. The 5 qis in Ding Ning's body suddenly became turbulent and became more and more turbulent, even causing his internal organs to rapidly expand. The 5 energies surged madly into his qi, squeezing the true essence in his body and causing it to emit a crystalline glow. Jing Liuli suddenly raised her head and looked at Ding Ning, her eyes filled with shock. She sensed that there seemed to be 5 more spirit veins in Ding Ning's body. 5 spirit veins that were constantly spewing out spirit qi. She took a deep breath, and her gaze landed on the strands of hair on Ding Ning's head. It was unknown whether it was the change in his vital essence or the effect of the medicine, but the white hair roots on his head had visibly returned to their original black color. She calmly watched this change and then slowly exhaled. If she had not seen it with her own eyes, she would not have believed there was such a cultivation speed in the world. Even though the 9-death silkworm and the heaven-replenishing divine art were able to perfectly endure the disadvantageous parts of these 2 spirit medicines, the taste of each mouthful of medicine could not be eliminated. The medicine was extremely bitter and astringent. Ding Ning's gaze grew calmer. The pain in life was usually self-inflicted, but the pain that other people gave him, he hoped there would be a chance in the future for other people to pay for it. Deep in the quiet Chongling Imperial Palace, the spirit lotuses growing in the spirit veins still swayed in the faint and pure sunlight. Palace attendant Rong stood respectfully at the bottom of this spirit spring. Facing her was the mistress that almost everyone in Chongling feared. The Empress features were still flawless, and there were no visible emotions. She was like a god. That youngster called Chun Fuchin, he wasn't sent by you? Her gaze did not land on Palace attendant Rong. She looked at the pure white spirit lotuses and said clearly. Palace attendant Rong said seriously, I did not send him. The Empress nodded and said, do not pay attention to him. Palace attendant Rong said yes, and the Empress did not speak. Palace attendant Rong bid farewell and left the Empress study. She knew the Empress' intentions, but because she knew too well, the words, do not pay attention to him, caused her to feel inexplicably cold. At the peak of Min Mountain, the world did not know where the coldness of Min Mountain came from, nor did they know that the cold energies at the peak of Min Mountain were attracted by a formation and gathered in one place to form craggy ice crystals dozens of feet wide. This cold room that had been crudely carved out with a sword among the craggy ice crystals was Bailey Sushue's residence. The world knew that Bailey Sushue was a loner and always lived in the coldest place of Min Mountain. Most cultivators speculated that the method or sword essence he cultivated required extreme cold, but only Bailey Sushue knew this was not the case. The world did not know him, and at the same time, he had deceived the world. So in this ice crystal room, his lips that were even whiter in contrast to the ice and snow often had a hint of self-mockery and disdain. After slowly reading through a few scrolls, he casually threw the scrolls to the side. Then, the scrolls were quickly covered by an icy aura and sealed in ice. He raised his head slightly and walked out. Not far from his cold room stood a young woman. She was tall, the eldest daughter of the Guanzhong Xie family, Xie Rou. While most of the cold energy at the peak of Min Mountain had been gathered in the ice room where Bailey Sushue lived, even the remaining coldness caused Xie Rou's face to turn black and her body to tremble uncontrollably. Do you believe there are so-called miracles in the world? Bailey Sushue looked at Xie Rou and asked coolly. Xie Rou, who had been waiting for many hours in this world of ice and snow, suddenly saw Bailey Sushue and heard such words. She opened her mouth in shock, her gums chattering, but did not know what to say. In reality, there are no so-called miracles. Bailey Sushue did not wait for Xie Rou's response. He glanced at Xie Rou and then looked at Lu Yun in front of him. He said coldly, while you have enough determination and courage, with your cultivation talent, the peak you can reach in this life is Realm 7 at most. Xie Rou still did not understand Bailey Sushue's words. But this time, Bailey Sushue did not continue and waited for a long time for her response. She still did not know how to answer, but her personality caused her to answer in the end. It is enough to reach Realm 7. So this is your choice. I believe there are no so-called miracles, no unwillingness. This is enough. Bailey Sushue waved his hand simply, indicating that she could leave. When Xie Rou was stunned, he said coolly, Min Mountain Sword Sect does not have only one method of using wealth to exchange for cultivation, but the Qin dynasty only has the Xie family. Fortunately, you did not disappoint me. So go find Qin Yaoyin. He will help you reach Realm 7, and then you will only reach Realm 7 for the rest of your life. Xie Rou's breathing stopped completely, but she started to truly understand Bailey Sushue's meaning. It will not be quick. As Bailey Sushue turned, his cold and proud voice reached Xie Rou's ears. You will be in seclusion in Min Mountain Sword Sect for a long time. At the same time Bailey Sushue turned, Palace attendant Rong walked into the side courtyard she lived in the Imperial Palace. While she had decided to live in the palace in this period of time, she was still one of the most well-informed people in Chongling. So some information about Ding Ning was passed to her as quickly as possible. She knew Ding Ning's cultivation had passed Realm 4 second class. She knew that Jing Lioli was following Ding Ning, and even seemed to be Ding Ning's student in front of Ding Ning. She knew that the medicines collected by the Guanzhong people had been sent to Ink Garden. While she did not know the use of these medicines, they definitely had something to do with Ding Ning's cultivation. Adding on the Empress' attitude today, she felt great pressure. When she walked into this deserted courtyard, she could not help but say softly to herself, "Why won't you let me go?" But in the next breath, Ding Ning's face appeared in her mind, and she heard Ding Ning's answer. You also did not let go of Old Man Shui. It was hot summer, but it was clearly cold. Chapter 367. Doing the same thing over and over again was dry and tedious. If one did the same thing without rest or sleep, it would be a kind of torture over time. In the legends, in many prisons, the best and most effective way to force a confession was to not let the prisoner sleep for a long time until the prisoner's mind completely collapsed. Jing Liuli continued to brew medicine. Because no one was using external force to force her, she was only fighting with her own willpower. Therefore, after a long time, her exhaustion accumulated even more. In this world, great cultivation could do astounding things. But similarly, astounding wealth could also do astounding things. For example, the 2 carts of medicinal herbs that the rich people of Guangzhou had collected. The celestial demon vine and the wolf venom flower were both extremely rare spiritual herbs. Take the wolf venom flower, for example. This kind of spiritual herb only grew by itself. In the tundra, where the temperature difference between day and night was extremely great, it was possible to find one within a radius of several miles. Yet in just a few days, the celestial demon vine and wolf poison flower had piled up into 2 carts. It would take a long time to brew such an astounding amount of spirit medicines into medicine. Since she started to brew medicine, she had not closed her eyes for many days. The reason she did not rest was not because she could fight against her own willpower from the start, but because Ding Ning had not rested at all. When she finished brewing the first 3 pots of medicine, Ding Ning had coincidentally finished drinking the first 3 pots at an almost perfect and constant frequency. Looking at Ding Ning, who was calmly drinking medicine like he had been a few days ago, Jing Liuli was not thinking about Ding Ning's cultivation speed that defied the natural laws of cultivation. She could not help but think that even the young geniuses of Chongling could use this method to increase their cultivation. If they could not stop, those young geniuses would not have the willpower to continue for so long. Just brewing the medicine was already tiring for her, not to mention drinking such bitter medicine continuously. I really admire you. So when Ding Ning's almost perfect and constant frequency finally changed, and when Ding Ning stopped and indicated for her to stop brewing medicine, Jing Liuli turned to look at the remaining 2 kinds of medicinal herbs, and then at Ding Ning's hair that had turned completely black. Admire me for what? Ding Ning casually plucked some loquats from a ripe loquat tree in the yard. He slowly ate them, savoring the taste of sweetness after bitterness. Then he looked at Jing Liuli and smiled slightly. Admire me for not using the toilet for so long? Jing Liuli nodded seriously without a smile. That is one aspect. Her expression and reaction stunned Ding Ning. He grimaced and said, if it's too cold, it's not very funny. Jing Liuli did not feel that her words were a cold joke. She glanced at Ding Ning and asked, the medicinal herbs are not used up. You clearly have the power to continue, and your cultivation does not seem to have reached the point of a true breakthrough. Why stop? We're going out. Ding Ning did not keep her in suspense. He looked at her and said directly, from the start, our plan against Palace Attendant Rome was to continuously pressure her. Continuously pressuring her is much more useful than pressuring her all at once. Something like pressure is like tiredness. It is most terrifying when accumulated. After a pause, the bitterness in Ding Ning's mouth disappeared, replaced by the sweetness of ripe loquats. He started to walk out. My present cultivation is enough to deal with Dr. AI. Jing Liuli followed him and said with a frown, who is Dr. AI? Ding Ning said, the boss of Longevity Hall, and also one of the famed doctors of Chongling. Jing Liuli said, what is his connection to this palace attendant? Ding Ning glanced at her and said, in the early years, Palace Attendant Rong received his favor. In these years, Palace Attendant Rong obtained power and repaid him greatly. Longevity Hall is in its present state mostly because of this. Jing Liuli looked in puzzlement at him. Just because he is Palace Attendant Rong's benefactor, you want to deal with him? Of course not just because of this, Ding Ning said calmly, but I cannot tell you the reason right now. Jing Liuli did not speak. In this period of time, she truly thought of Ding Ning as her teacher. Since her teacher could not speak, she would not pursue the matter. West of the city, near the North Seven Corner Tower. After giving a precise location, Ding Ning stepped into the carriage, closed his eyes, and started to rest. A middle-aged man in casual robes was standing at the window of a tea house not far from Inn Garden. Looking at the carriage coming out of Inn Garden, a disdainful expression appeared at the corners of his mouth. However, at this moment, he suddenly had a strange feeling in his heart. It was as if something that made him feel uncomfortable was approaching him from behind. He abruptly turned around and frowned deeply, because there was nothing unusual behind him. The carriage coming out of Inn Garden affected the nerves of many people. When Jing Lioli drove the carriage into the west of the city and headed straight for a corner tower, Palace Attendant Rong, deep in the Chongling Imperial Palace, knew the destination of the carriage. Palace Attendant Rong stood under the eaves and looked silently in the direction of the turret in the west of the city. Her expression was still calm, but her breathing grew heavier. They were heading towards Longevity Hall. Was Ding Ning certain he could deal with that person? Dr. AI was a very kind middle-aged man. He was one of the famed doctors of Chongling, skilled in vital energy and blood circulation to stimulate natural vitality. Some healing methods required vital energy, so his cultivation was not a secret. In Chongling, a middle-aged man who spent decades to just pass Realm 5 did not have any great talent. Yet most cultivators knew that the strength of a cultivator could not be determined based on vital energy cultivation alone. Dressed in a thin silk robe, Dr. AI stood at the door of a residence that was dozens of acres in size and watched the carriage arrive. Longevity Hall was next to his residence. This famous medical shop in Chongling was not as grand as his residence. Many outsiders or Chongling people who did not live in this area could not connect the owner of Longevity Hall to this residence. Do you want me to act? Or do you want to act? Looking at the middle-aged man standing alone at the door, Jing Lioli turned to ask Ding Ning in the carriage. Ding Ning slowly opened his eyes and said simply, "I will." "All right." Jing Lioli nodded. A sword essence came from in front of her and landed 70 paces in front of her. Then she bowed her head and released all of her exhaustion. She fell into a deep sleep as she did so. The carriage continued to move forward steadily, but after 70 steps, when it reached the place where her sword intent landed, the horse pulling the carriage suddenly felt great fear, once again freezing in place. Ding Ning ignored the horse that did not dare to move, and Jing Lioli, who had fallen asleep. He calmly got off the carriage. Dr. AI was just 100 feet in front of him. Then he nodded simply at Dr. AI and said, "I want to challenge you." Dr. AI also gave an unusually simple smile and said, "Then let's start." Chapter 368. When Dr. AI spoke, the primal energies of the universe around him suddenly changed and gave off a sharp presence. Jing Lioli had just fallen into a deep sleep for a few breaths. But at this time, her eyelashes fluttered and she opened her eyes, falling into a deep sleep in an instant, using a short rest to eliminate some of her fatigue and try to make herself more awake. This was something that Jing Lioli could only do after experiencing many unimaginable hardships in Min Mountain Sword Sect. With her willpower, she could definitely endure without sleep for a long time. She wanted to sleep for a short time because she wanted her mind to be clearer and not miss any scene of Ding Ning and Dr. AI's battle. But she had not expected it to be so short. In her imagination, Ding Ning and Dr. AI would have to have a conversation, and even Ding Ning would have to use some methods to force Dr. AI to fight him. A deep sleep that was too short was like passing through different consciousness spaces. It made her head even dizzier and her thoughts inexplicably chaotic. But she still felt it was strange. She had gradually become familiar with Ding Ning. She sensed that when Ding Ning faced Dr. AI, he did not have the sharpness he had when facing Palace Attendant Rong and her old lover. So when she narrowed her eyes to avoid the blazing sun and looked at Dr. AI, she felt that Dr. AI was not being forced, but facilitating this battle. Ding Ning did not give her enough time to wake up and think. As soon as Dr. AI finished speaking, he nodded and raised the last flower remnant sword to his chest. He said calmly, "Then let's start." Dr. AI shook his head gently and seemed to be emotional. His face was very gentle. Since he was a famous doctor, He usually dealt with patients with all kinds of chronic diseases that were difficult to treat and were in pain. His expression and tone were used to comfort the patients, so the way he spoke at this moment was even more amiable. But the moment he shook his head, his right sleeve was torn. A dark sword light, the color of which was like the accumulated tea stains on an old teapot, carrying a ruthless aura that did not match Ding Ning's appearance, directly tore his sleeve apart and fell to the ground. But when it was only an inch away from the ground, it suddenly produced a low, buzzing sound and swept towards Ding Ning's feet like lightning. Cries of surprise rang out in the surrounding streets. Because the duel between Ding Ning and Dr. AI had started too quickly, the pedestrians in the surrounding streets hadn't even realized what had happened, especially those who were familiar with Dr. AI. They didn't expect Dr. AI to be a swordsman and use a flying sword as soon as he attacked. Only cultivators above Realm 5 could control flying swords. Flying swords were separated from the cultivator's body, but still followed the cultivator's will and sword essence. In the eyes of the world, a swordsman who could control flying swords was not an ordinary swordsman. Even in a battle between armies, there were many swordsmen who could use flying swords, but each swordsman who could use flying swords would be protected by many powerful soldiers. Ding Ning had won against opponents who used flying swords in the Min Mountain Sword Trials. But in Chongling, and even the entire world, most ordinary people and cultivators had never seen a person who could not control a flying sword challenge a swordsman who could use a flying sword alone. Any figure appeared too slow for a flying sword that moved like lightning. When the dark sword light fell to the ground, Ding Ning had already moved. His left foot stepped heavily on the ground, and his body started to accelerate forward. He could not use his flying sword. He had to get close, and only when he was a true threat at close range could he affect the other's control of the flying sword. But just as his left foot stepped on the ground, the dark sword light was already less than 3 feet away from his left ankle. But at this time, there was a crack. A sword light with a thick fiendish presence landed in front of the dark flying sword. The flying sword that could change direction with a single thought was unable to dodge in time and collided directly with the sword light. There was no sound of metal colliding. There was only the sound of ice cracking. Crystal pieces visible to the naked eye flew in front of Ding Ning's ankle. Ding Ning's body was already in the air. These pieces spread out under his feet and bloomed into blue-black flames like an evil blue-black flower. Dr. AI's gaze grew cold. He knew that Ding Ning was strong, but he had not expected him to be so strong. His flying sword did not dare to continue to cut at any part of Ding Ning's body, but flew towards Ding Ning's side and put some distance between them. At this time, a thin layer of frost had formed on the surface of his flying sword. The star fiendish energy that repelled other primal energies of the universe even caused the primal energies in his flying sword's seal scripts to become unstable. A cloud of dust rose from the tips of his feet. He hurriedly retreated. When Ding Ning advanced, he retreated. But Ding Ning had not truly attacked. He only used a small sword formed from the star fiendish energy he had accumulated in his body. The last flower remnant sword in front of his chest stabbed out as his body flew up, and a blue-black flower bloomed under his feet. The sky was clear, but the moment he moved his sword, lines of rain suddenly appeared in the sky above Dr. AI. The crystalline rain fell. It seemed gentle, but when it landed on the roof tiles of the courtyard behind Dr. AI, it immediately showed its violent side. There was a burst of cracking sounds, and debris flew. Dr. AI's figure suddenly stopped. Many people who had arrived with Jing Liuli's carriage could not believe their eyes. At this time, Ding Ning's figure had closed in on Dr. AI. That brown flying sword landed behind Ding Ning. With just one blow, Ding Ning forced Dr. AI's flying sword away and forced him to stop. At this time, they had not been able to sense Ding Ning's progress in cultivation. But a Realm 4 cultivator facing a Realm 5 swordsman who could use a flying sword seemed to have the upper hand in one exchange. This was enough to shock them. With just one blow, no cultivator present thought highly of Dr. AI. However, it was also at this moment that the atmosphere changed completely. Uncontrollable cries of surprise rang out. Dr. AI stopped and glanced at Ding Ning. His left sleeve also split open at this moment. His left hand held a black gold round plate. It looked like a shallow basin that many families in Chongling would use to hold vegetables. But at this time, Dr. AI's vital energy poured relentlessly into this black gold disc. Countless black gold stars started to fly out of the black gold disc. These stars of light were like grains of dust that surrounded Dr. AI's body. Countless fine, dark golden stars of light formed a bell-shaped dust barrier around his body. Chaos Gold Shield. Someone in the street shouted the name of this item in shock. This was a famous seal weapon that came from a workshop of the former Han Dynasty. It had appeared many times in the battles between the Qin Dynasty and the Han Dynasty. When the former Han Dynasty's army was completely defeated and the Han Dynasty disappeared into history, this seal weapon that was like a loyal servant to a swordsman who could use a flying sword appeared in the hands of a famous doctor in Chongling. Even more importantly, this was a seal weapon that all cultivators below Realm 7 could use, and it could display the power of the cultivator's vital energy. Dr. AI was Realm 5, so the power that the Chaos Gold Shield gave off was like a Realm 5 sword-wielding cultivator protecting Dr. AI from all directions. Ding Ning only had Realm 4 power. How could he break through a Realm 5 defense? Based on the common sense of the cultivation world, Dr. AI was invincible. So even Jing Lioli started to suspect that her judgment had been wrong because she had woken up immediately after falling asleep. But Ding Ning did not give her time to think. Just as the dark, golden light scattered, his left hand was already raised straight up. A string of terrifying explosions sounded. When the ear-piercing sound of the explosion reached everyone's ears, the blue-black, cold, fiendish swords had already collided with the dark gold dust cover. All the cold, fiendish swords hit the same place, one after another. The energy inside the shield shook. Dr. AI grunted, his face suddenly pale. Balls of blue-black flame energy overlapped together, forming countless transparent ripples. The shield shook countless times in an instant, but it still did not break. He didn't even have time to cry out before another sword pierced the dust cover. Ding Ning was in front of the exploding balls of flame energy. His last flower remnant sword was covered in fine white flowers as it stabbed hard at the shield. Dr. AI knew this was the moment of victory. His pupils contracted violently, but his gaze flashed violently. That flying sword fell towards Ding Ning's back like a meteor. Ding Ning did not care about this flying sword. He only stabbed forward with all his power. With an enormous boom, a part of the shield in front of his sword was suddenly empty. The Chaos Gold Shield was broken. Chapter 369. The sword essence that surged out of the last flower remnant sword carried all the shattered star fiendish energy and the black gold dust to hit Dr. AI's chest. With a muffled sound, Dr. AI's chest quickly caved in. He flew like a bird with broken wings and hit the door behind him. Another explosive sound rang out, and the entire courtyard door was torn apart, splashing into countless fragments. Dr. AI fell to the ground in dejection. When he vomited blood, the wood chips in front of him were still flying. Blood dyed the wood chips red. The tea-like flying sword pointed at Ding Ning's back suddenly lost its strength and flew by Ding Ning's ear. After flying dozens of feet, it was finally unable to support itself and fell to the ground with a clang. Ding Ning looked at the falling flying sword and stopped moving forward. All the spectating cultivators were shocked speechless. From the beginning of the attack to the final blow that defeated Dr. AI, Ding Ning had done it all in one go, completely at his own pace. If it was an opponent of the same cultivation, such a smooth attack would only be amazing. But Ding Ning and Dr. AI were one cultivation realm apart, but he still completely controlled the rhythm of the sword. Not only was it amazing, but it also started to make people feel fear. Ding Ning nodded slightly at Dr. AI, who could not stand up and was still bleeding from his mouth. He turned and walked towards his carriage. Only now did many people come back to their senses and think of what they had not reacted to just now. How can there be such a cultivation speed? The result of this was even greater shock and terror. This kind of emotion caused several people to cry out, and these people were the ones with the highest cultivation among the spectating cultivators. They had judged Ding Ning's cultivation. When the Min Mountain Sword trials had ended, Ding Ning had just entered Realm 4. This could not be wrong. Countless cultivation teachers who had attended the Min Mountain Sword trials had seen it with their own eyes. Ding Ning could not even disguise his cultivation. Ding Ning had been seriously injured during the Min Mountain Sword trials and returned to Ink Garden to recuperate. Yet when he left Ink Garden to see Palace Attendant Roan and killed the galloping horse with one blow, he was Realm 4 second class. Only a few days had passed, but Ding Ning's cultivation had already taken a huge step forward. What kind of concept was that? Even in all the historical records, and even in some storybooks, there was no record of such a fast cultivation. This was clearly absurd, yet it was happening right in front of them, causing them to be unable to control themselves. As she watched Ding Ning calmly walk back to the carriage, Jing Lioli lowered her head slightly and did not say anything. By the time she drove the carriage away from this street, waves after waves of exclamations rippled out behind her like a tide. She still maintained her posture with her head slightly lowered, but her low voice was transmitted into Ding Ning's ears in the carriage. "Dr. AI is one of us? How do you know?" Ding Ning responded tiredly as he leaned against the back wall of the carriage, his head bowed slightly. "Too fast, too few words," Jing Lioli said. "I feel that he agreed to fight you too readily." Ding Ning's posture did not change. He said, "He does not have the ability to refuse. He cannot offend those people from Guangzhou. Also, he cannot hide in the palace like Palace Attendant Rome. He knows that if he does not agree, he will encounter many embarrassing things. Not just this problem." Jing Lioli frowned. She thought for a moment, but did not know how to describe it. She said, "I feel that something is not right." Ding Ning raised his head slightly to look at her back and said seriously, "You have improved." Receiving an affirmative answer, Jing Lioli grew inexplicably silent. She thought for a moment and then said, "You did not care about his flying sword to break his seal weapon in the end. Is it because he is one of us? Or because even if he was not one of us, you would have done the same? Are you certain you can break through his seal weapon defense, and his flying sword cannot harm you?" Ding Ning knew what she was thinking and answered seriously, "If he was not one of us, I would have done the same." Jing Lioli's eyebrows rose, and she could not help but turn her head. But Ding Ning was already speaking. "I know what you are thinking. In your view, his flying sword seems to be faster than mine. So you cannot understand why I dared to do so, and why I was faster than him in the end. Because he thought one more thing than me. Even if he is a true opponent, he will think one more thing than me." After a pause, Ding Ning looked at her and said, "He will first think if he can block my attack, or if I have other moves. Even if he subconsciously thinks if he can block my attack, he will be slower than me. Because if I want to attack, I will not leave a way out. You have to understand, even if some people can use two swords, at the same time, they will not be able to attend to two things. If he thinks about defense, the attack from behind will be slower." Jing Lioli was much smarter than most cultivators in the world when it came to cultivation. She quickly nodded to show that she understood Ding Ning's words. Then she said, "Dr. AI is seriously wounded, but will not die. So this is a plan to kill two birds with one stone? You challenge him to a duel. You can let that palace attendant see your astounding progress. Give her great pressure, and make her trust Dr. AI more. In the future, Dr. AI may become an important pawn to deal with her." Ding Ning nodded and said with unusual sincerity, "You have improved greatly." Jing Lioli turned around and bowed slightly to him. She said sincerely, "Thanks to you." Hearing her words, Ding Ning said with slight self-mockery, "Why does it sound like I harmed you?" This battle happened very quickly, and it ended very quickly as well. However, the news of the battle spread even faster. In a corner of Yi Sealing's little courtyard, a gardenia was silently blooming. With a quiet sound, a blue messenger pigeon flew in. This pigeon had flown in many times and was familiar with Bai Shanshui. So when Bai Shanshui's hand reached towards it, it did not dodge and allowed Bai Shanshui to take down the letter tube at its feet. Looking at the contents of the letter tube, Bai Shanshui looked at Yi Sealing, who was standing solemnly at the side, and smiled emotionally. As expected of his heir, it is not a coincidence that a Realm 4 can win against a Realm 5. Yi Sealing did not respond. He took the paper scroll from her hand and read it carefully. Then he turned to smile at her and showed 2 beautiful dimples. He should have comprehended the heaven-replenishing divine art. Bai Shanshui raised an eyebrow. Yi Sealing put away his smile and bowed his head slightly. He said coolly, in the past, he always wanted to cultivate the heaven-replenishing divine art, but was unable to do so. If he had obtained the heaven-replenishing divine art earlier, maybe Chongling would not be like this now. I only look at the future, not the past. Bai Shanshui said with some pride, if he is going to force that palace attendant, I only hope that he will move faster. Almost at the same time, the results of Ding Ning and Dr. AI's battle passed into the depths of the Imperial Palace and into the ears of Palace Attendant Rome. Her expression did not change at all, not because of calmness, but because of terror. Terror was a very unfamiliar emotion to her. She had even forgotten this emotion. It was not that she was arrogant, but she knew her position. She was loyal to the Empress and could settle down. But now, this emotion uncontrollably spread through her body. After dozens of breaths, her body started to tremble. How is it possible? How can his cultivation rise so quickly? Her voice rang out. The voice was strange and ear-piercing. She did not know that she had spoken, and even felt that it was not her voice. Already past realm for second class. At the same time, the Empress looked up slightly. She did not look at the middle-aged man in yellow robes standing respectfully outside the study, but the pure light coming down from the well above. Heaven replenishing divine art. She slowly said these words in her mind. Chapter 370. The carriage could not be fast on the stone paths of Chongling, but the transmission of news was much faster than carriages. When the people who heard the news along the way, especially the cultivators, saw the carriage that appeared in their sight, many people showed shock and even a hint of fanaticism and worship. On the second floor of a pawn shop, a slightly bald, middle-aged, and slightly fat official looked with a complicated expression at Jing Lioli and the carriage behind Jing Lioli. He could not help but shake his head. He was Mo Qinggong. He was one of the most experienced evil dogs of the Divinity Bureau. At the same time, he was the first official of Chongling to come into contact with Ding Ning, and the first official to admire Ding Ning. Official, you have good eyes. Everyone now knows that this youth is extraordinary. But they do not know that you felt this youth was extraordinary when you saw him for the first time in the rain last year. An official of the Divinity Bureau next to him was attracted by the carriage and did not see Mo Qinggong shake his head. He could not help but praise softly. Pity that my opinion of this youth has changed. Mo Qinggong turned to look at him and said coldly. The Divinity Bureau official next to him was shocked. He looked at Mo Qinggong, not knowing why he would say such a thing. This youth still does not know what he has done wrong. Mo Qinggong did not look at him. He narrowed his eyes at Jing Lioli's carriage and said expressionlessly, look at the gazes these people are looking at him. Other than that person back then, when have the people of Chongling ever looked at someone with such fanaticism and worship? In all these years, the people of Chongling have only looked at one person with such gazes. They did not even look at the Holy One like this. Even after the Deer Mountain Conference ended. After a pause, Mo Qinggong ignored the reaction of his confidant and said slowly, back then, the Holy One hid his power so much that such gazes could not land on him. And now, the Holy One. Even after the Deer Mountain Conference, the people of Chongling still do not have such gazes. It is not because the Holy One is not strong enough, but because in most people's view, a Realm 8 defeating a Realm 7, the strong defeating the weak, is normal and inevitable. For most people in Chongling, what they worship is not the normal and inevitable, but the legends, the people who create inconceivable miracles. After saying this, Mo Qinggong was silent for a moment, and then concluded. The Holy One will not wish for a person like this to appear again. The Holy One is naturally the master of Chongling and the world. So this youth's actions are not acceptable. There was a Realm 6 cultivator upstairs in the pawn shop just now. There was a Realm 5 cultivator beside the herbal tea shop at the entrance of the alley. The rider that passed by us just now is also a Realm 5 cultivator. In the carriage, Ding Ning appeared to be asleep, but after passing by Mo Qinggong's pawn shop, he did not open his eyes but suddenly spoke to Jing Lioli. Jing Lioli's eyebrows rose. She did not know why Ding Ning suddenly said this. Ding Ning still did not open his eyes, but his voice passed clearly into her ears. She narrowed her eyes slightly. When a cultivator fights an enemy, the first thing they have to ensure is not how to defeat the enemy as quickly as possible, but how to ensure their own safety. The great majority of powerful cultivators do not die in one-on-one battles, but in chaotic formations and assassinations. That is why, as a cultivator, you have to pay attention to every single person who can pose a threat to you at all times. Even if that person looks extremely weak to you, as long as there is the slightest chance of them killing you, you have to pay attention to that person. Jing Lioli thought for a moment. While she did not understand why Ding Ning would suddenly think of these principles at a time like this, she felt that Ding Ning's words were useful. This was something she should pay attention to. So she did not say anything and nodded slightly to indicate that she had remembered. We will rest for 6 hours. 6 hours later, you will continue to make medicine for me. Ding Ning said, in 5 days, we will go find Daoist Qian. Jing Lioli suddenly looked up. She had some questions to ask, but at this time, a carriage was approaching. She had seen the person driving the carriage before. It was one of the 2 carriage drivers who had come to deliver medicine for the Xie family. He was from Guangzhou and was slightly older. There was an accident. Without any extra words, when her carriage stopped, this Guangzhou person bowed deeply to Ding Ning in the carriage and said softly, "One of our carriages was attacked. The second batch of medicine was destroyed." Jing Lioli's gaze suddenly turned cold. Ding Ning's voice still came calmly from the carriage. "It should be that the mistress of the palace does not want me to succeed. So tell Xie Changsheng to temporarily stop buying medicine for me. Otherwise, it will not reach my hands and will increase my losses." Hearing such a calm voice, the Guangzhou person who had come to deliver the news grew more respectful. He did not speak, bowed seriously, and then drove away. "You think it is the Empress?" Jing Lioli asked as she relaxed the reins and let the carriage continue forward. "Other than her, no one dares to offend all of these Guangzhou rich." Ding Ning took a deep breath and opened his eyes. He said with slight disdain, "I knew she would interfere, but I had not thought she would dare to use such simple and crude methods." Jing Lioli frowned and was silent for a moment. She turned slightly and asked Ding Ning, "Who is Daoist Qian that you just now speak of?" Palace Attendant Rong's teacher, the person who guided Palace Attendant Rong into cultivation, Ding Ning said. "He is now the master of the Boxwood Temple." As though he knew all the questions Jing Lioli had right now. Ding Ning paused, and before Jing Lioli could ask, he said, "In terms of continuously pressuring people, 3 to 5 days is a very good interval. Originally, I had predicted that the second batch of medicine the Xie family would send me in these 5 days would be enough for my cultivation to advance greatly and reach Realm 4 first class." Jing Lioli thought for a breath and asked, "Do you want people to see your great improvement in cultivation, or do you only have a chance of defeating Daoist Qian when you reach that level of cultivation?" Ding Ning glanced at her and nodded. "Daoist Qian is harder to deal with," Jing Lioli said after a moment of thought. "Since the Empress has expressed such an attitude, then the Xie family will not send any more medicine to Ink Garden in the future." Ding Ning did not speak and nodded again. A hint of coldness rose in Jing Lioli's eyes, and a cold anger burned. However, an indescribable expression appeared on Ding Ning's face at this moment. He had waited for too long in Falling Parasol. In addition, many things had happened many years ago. They were so distant that they had naturally faded from his memory. But as he did these days, when the surrounding passers-by looked at him with fanatical admiration, he started to remember some things. Of all the people in Chongling, Zhangsun Qinxue hated Empress Zhengxiu the most. Zhangsun Qinxue did not want him to mention Zhengxiu at all, and he had purposefully avoided some memories related to Zhengxiu. But when some memories recovered, and the CF family suddenly came to report what Zheng Xiu had done, he remembered a matter related to Zheng Xiu that had faded from his memories. Chapter 371. Turn left at the alley ahead. Ding Ning's expression slowly calmed, and then he said to Jing Lioli. It was just a light direction, but Jing Lioli heard something unusual in the tone. The icy anger in her eyes quickly faded. Then, like a real maid, she nodded obediently and began to drive the carriage with peace of mind. Go forward and then turn left. Jing Lioli did not know where Ding Ning was going next, but she was certain that Ding Ning was not going back to Ink Garden. Soon, everyone who had been paying attention to the movements of this carriage found that this carriage was not going back to Ink Garden. Today, Ding Ning had shocked all of Chongling by breaking through to Realm 5 as Realm 4. Was he going to do something next? Because it had been so long. Even though he had recalled some memories, these memories were still blurry. So he was slow in directing, and Jing Lioli's carriage was also slow. Ding Ning was extremely familiar with the present streets of Chongling. He could even clearly judge when the army stationed in Chongling would arrive at a certain location after a signal was sent from any turret. But the present Chongling was not the Chongling of the past. He focused on the present and rarely thought about what these streets had been like many years ago and what each courtyard had been used for. Many courtyards had completely changed. Some places that used to be farmlands had become bustling markets. Some places that used to be wineries had now become dye houses. Some places that used to be dye houses had now become places where people went to look for prostitutes. They seemed to have become private residences. His thoughts moved along with the changing streets and courtyards. His memories slowly overlapped with the present Chongling. Then he could not help but whisper to himself, "What?" Jing Lioli heard his voice and could not help but turn to ask. Ding Ning looked up and looked ahead. He did not answer her question and said softly, "We are almost there." Following Ding Ning's gaze, Jing Lioli saw gray eaves. The same gray eaves were not as righteous as most gray eaves in Chongling. When the edges of the eaves flew up, they looked like a pair of graceful bird feathers. Her brows furrowed unconsciously. She knew that this kind of roof was the style of Jiaodong Commandery. As the carriage moved forward, everyone who was paying attention to the movements of the carriage could see that the courtyard was Ding Ning's destination. However, even the owner of this courtyard was puzzled by Ding Ning's arrival. Facing Jing Lioli, who was likely to be the next master of Min Mountain Sword Sect, and a genius like Ding Ning, no owner of a courtyard would be indifferent. No owner dared to be arrogant and ignore unless they did not know the identities of Jing Lioli and Ding Ning. When Jing Lioli's carriage stopped in front of the gates of this courtyard, the owner of this courtyard slowly walked out. The owner of this courtyard was a middle-aged man with a short beard, dressed in black silk robes. Jing Lioli did not know the identity of this middle-aged man, but even she could see that this middle-aged man had an ugly expression. At least he did not welcome her and Ding Ning's arrival. Ding Ning's brows furrowed slightly. He knew the identity of this middle-aged man, but he did not think that this middle-aged man had any history with him. So he did not understand why the other had such an expression. He got off the carriage and bowed slightly to the middle-aged man. He said, "Junior Ding Ning greets Palace General Liu." Palace General was not this person's name, but his official position. This middle-aged man's surname was Liu, and he was one of the gate guards of the Qin dynasty's imperial palace. Ding Ning greeted him as a junior. The gate guards were not of high status to him and Jing Lioli, so he was very respectful to this middle-aged man. Yet, the middle-aged man had a cold smile on his face. He nodded slightly and said indifferently, "I do not know that an accomplished disciple of Min Mountain Sword Sect has suddenly come to visit. Please excuse me for not coming out to greet you. What is the matter?" When I was at the Falling Parasol wine shop, I heard that many years ago, the Gold Osmanthus winery here was the most famous winery in Chongling. Now, the Gold Osmanthus winery no longer exists, but I heard that a patch of Gold Osmanthus winery was left behind. Ding Ning looked at the unfriendly Palace General Liu and said calmly, "I want to enter this patch of Gold Osmanthus, dig up a Gold Osmanthus, and move it to Ink Garden." "What do you mean?" Hearing his words, Palace General Liu stilled slightly and then asked with a frown. Ding Ning looked at him and said, "Previously, when I was making wine, I wanted to make some osmanthus wine. I thought that since I left in garden today, and there is space in Ink Garden, I might as well come to the best gold osmanthus winery to ask for one. If Palace General Liu is willing to part with it today, I will do my best to repay you in the future." Palace General Liu was shocked. Because he was so shocked, the coldness on his face lessened slightly. Jing Lioli could not help but glance at Ding Ning. Even she felt that Ding Ning's words were absurd and unbelievable. Ding Ning was not in a hurry. He looked calmly at Palace General Liu and waited for his answer. It was not important what reason he gave. What was most important was that he had expressed his attitude. He knew that Palace General Liu would know the weight of his words. What he said now was no different from what the Guanzhong Xie family had said. Also, he had Min Mountain Sword sect behind him. "Apologies, I refuse." Palace Commander Liu took a deep breath. When the stunned expression on his face began to fade, his gaze returned to indifference. Then he shook his head and said, Ding Ning looked at him and said, "Even if you refuse, you need a reason." "A reason?" Palace General Liu, who knew that Ding Ning's words also carried weight, sneered, and the disdain grew. "The reason is very simple." This palace general lowered his voice, his lips barely moving as he squeezed out a cold voice. "It is not because I want to curry favor with Palace Attendant Rome. Quite the opposite. I do not like that palace attendant who pretends to be powerful. But it is a pity that I am a former subordinate of General Liang. You should know what you and Wang Taishu mean to General Liang." Ding Ning's gaze turned cold. He was slightly surprised. The words General Liang had been in his plan, but it had been later. He had not expected it to appear here. It seems that he is not as useless as many people think. Ding Ning looked at this palace general, and a cold smile appeared at the corners of his mouth. "But have you truly considered the consequences of making such a decision? Do not threaten me. It is normal to repay a favor." Palace General Liu narrowed his eyes slightly and looked up without looking at Ding Ning. He said coldly, "Even a talented general like General Liang has such a fate. It is good enough for someone like me to be a palace general in Chongling. I don't expect to be able to take another step forward. We soldiers do simple things. Also, I know the methods you are most skilled in these days." After a pause, this palace general looked at Ding Ning and said disdainfully, "If you dare to challenge me, if you can win, so what if you move the entire gold osmanthus garden out of my residence, much less a single osmanthus?" This palace general's voice was not low. Many people heard his words clearly. Then many people could not help but shake their heads. "I know that with my cultivation, it is very shameless to say something like this." This palace general looked at Ding Ning and said with slight disdain, "But your methods in the Min Mountain Sword trials, including forcing that palace attendant, are also very shameless." Jing Lioli raised an eyebrow. She turned to look at Ding Ning. She did not know what Ding Ning could do when a Realm 6 second-class palace general said something like this. Ding Ning was silent. There would always be a way, but at this moment, he could not think of a way for him to enter the gold osmanthus forest. But at this time, a soft voice came from the alley behind him and Jing Lioli. "Agree to him." The voice was very simple. Looking in the direction of the voice, everyone saw a long-haired youth dressed in light purple robes slowly walk over. "Otherwise, I will challenge you." This youth, with delicate features and long hair casually falling behind him, looked seriously at Palace General Liu, whose face was gradually paling, and said, "Then maybe we will die together." When they saw this youth's appearance, many people gathered in the surroundings felt shock and disbelief. The Qin dynasty had 13 marquises. This youth was a subordinate of one of the 13 marquises. That marquis was usually not in Chongling. He should be the marquis who had the least connection to Ding Ning. Many breaths later, some people could not help but inhale sharply. They started to realize why. Chapter 372. The Qin dynasty had defeated the Han, Zhao, and Wei dynasties, and had 13 marquises in total. These 13 marquises and their subordinates each guarded a region. They were like 13 strong cornerstones that supported the unprecedentedly powerful empire. These 13 marquises naturally had status far above ordinary court officials in the Qin dynasty. Their status came from the countless enemy experts they had killed, from their military exploits, and from the great power they possessed. From a certain point of view, they had taken down much of the Qin dynasty's present territory, so they should have extraordinary status. So for Chongling, they were nobility who could speak and could express their attitudes and opinions on some matters. This young man was a subordinate of one of the marquises. His appearance at this time represented the attitude of that marquis. If he belonged to the Dugubai establishment, maybe it was because of Dugubai, but he belonged to the marquis establishment that had the least connection to Ding Ning. Thinking of Fang Xiaomu's departure at the Deer Mountain Conference, Fang Xiang's meridians were severed, and his cultivation was crippled. The Fang marquis establishment only existed in name. Some people present started to realize that this young man represented the attitude of all the marquis establishments. In the past many years, while Empress Zhengxiu's control over Chongling was strict, she did things fairly and would not cross an invisible line. Now, all the marquises hoped that Empress Zhengxiu would follow her previous principles. Even more importantly, they were not willing to see the Bao disappear after the birds were killed. These marquises did not express any opinions on Zhengxiu's attitude towards White Goat Cave. But when Shui Wangshu died before the Min Mountain sword trial started, and on the matter of Ding Ning and Palace Attendant Rong, these marquises started to express their opinions. Palace Attendant Liu was not a greenhorn cultivator, so he knew better than most spectators the meaning of this young man standing up for Ding Ning. He could risk offending one marquis establishment, but he did not dare to offend all the marquises because some of the marquises were violent and cruel. His expression changed, but he did not make a sound. The long-haired young man with delicate features turned to look at Ding Ning and said softly, "We need a way out." Ding Ning bowed slightly in thanks. Then he turned to Palace General Liu and bowed seriously, saying, "Please grant my wish, General." Palace Guard Liu was silent for a moment. Without saying anything else, he turned and walked back to his courtyard. Everyone watched in silence as Jing Liuli and Ding Ning entered his courtyard. They did not understand what Ding Ning wanted to do. "Do I really have to dig up an osmanthus tree and bring it back?" Jing Liuli also did not understand what Ding Ning wanted to do. In her view, if the young man who represented the attitude of all the marquises had not come to the rescue today, Ding Ning's spirit would have been greatly damaged. Seeing Ding Ning walk straight to the osmanthus forest in the rear courtyard, she could not help but ask softly as she followed closely behind Ding Ning. Ding Ning did not turn his head and responded softly, "Later, you will have to put in more effort. When digging up the osmanthus tree, you will also have to dig up more earth." Jing Liuli's brow immediately furrowed, but she did not speak. She continued to follow behind Ding Ning with her head bowed like a true attendant. Unexpectedly, Ding Ning did not remain silent. After a slight pause, he asked, "What have you learned from today's events?" Jing Liuli stilled and said, "What?" "There's always a reason behind everything." Ding Ning still did not turn his head and said slowly, "Sometimes one cannot be unreasonable just because one's sword is vicious enough. Because most people would be worried that such unreasonable things would happen to them." The osmanthus forest in Palace Commander Liu's residence was very large. Most of the osmanthus trees were very old. Perhaps it was because these osmanthus trees were very old and rare that Palace Commander Liu did not change the layout of this osmanthus forest. Even the small pond in the osmanthus forest was not changed. However, compared to many years ago, some of the osmanthus trees in this osmanthus forest were slightly thicker. At this time, the lotus flowers in the pond were in full bloom. Ding Ning sat down on a rock by the pond. He silently looked at the lotus flowers in the pond for a long time. Then he stood up and kicked the edge of the rock. He said softly to the waiting Jing Liuli, "Cut a pure circle here, 6 feet deep. Do not damage the insides. Pull up the roots smoothly." Jing Liuli seriously pondered the meaning of Ding Ning's words. Then her gaze landed on the osmanthus tree closest to the rock. This osmanthus tree was very short but very thick. It seemed that this osmanthus tree would be in full bloom this autumn. Is there a problem if the branches and leaves are damaged? Many breaths later, she looked gravely at Ding Ning and asked. Ding Ning glanced at her and said, "No problem." Jing Liuli's gaze landed on the last flower remnant sword at Ding Ning's waist. "You did not have me bring a sword. You do not need my sword." Ding Ning's gaze landed on the short osmanthus tree. He said, "You can use it as a sword." Jing Liuli suddenly understood. She was silent for many breaths and then bowed seriously to Ding Ning. Then she turned around and faced the osmanthus tree. She gripped a thin branch that was tilted in front of her. Just like pulling out a sword, she pulled out the thin branch. There were many strange sounds coming from below the soil, as if a sharp weapon was cutting. But in this moment, her brow furrowed deeply. She sensed that she could not control this sword essence. Therefore, she made a change in an instant. When this thin branch was broken, it seemed to become a thin sword in her hand. Then she swung it down towards the ground. Her vital energy surged out of her body. The thin branch only shook for a moment before turning to dust, unable to withstand such terrifying power. But in this moment, the thin branch swung in an arc. With a hiss, a sword light drew a perfect circle along the osmanthus tree and fell into the ground. Jing Liuli took a step forward, gripped another thin branch, and pulled up again. The entire osmanthus tree was pulled up from the ground along with a circle of soil like a sword out of its sheath. There was a light cracking sound. Jing Liuli broke off this thin branch again. Jing Liuli's right wrist moved slightly and pulled up. This thin branch easily cut through the roots at the bottom of the soil and then lifted up the osmanthus tree along with a ball of soil. The thin branch, as thick as a finger, lifted up the heavy soil and the osmanthus tree. It did not even bend, but Jing Liuli's feet sank slightly into the ground. Her sleeves hissed, and her expression was not relaxed. Do as you wish, follow your heart. Do not stick to any sword. That is your sword essence. If you have too much confidence in your sword, you will naturally have thoughts of defeating your opponent with one sword. But this kind of thinking may not be in line with the sword essence you cultivate. Ding Ning looked at Jing Liuli, who was not relaxed, and said slowly and clearly. Then he started to walk out. Jing Liuli was not relaxed. She maintained a strong output of vital energy. Her body was slightly stiff, but when she heard Ding Ning's words, her breathing paused for a moment. Then she bowed to Ding Ning and started to walk. At the same time, she asked, "Directly in the carriage?" "Directly in the carriage. I can sit outside." Ding Ning did not turn his head and said, "Do not damage the soil. Do not damage the soil." This was a strange way of saying, but Jing Liuli seemed to understand his meaning. The people waiting outside Palace General Lu's residence were shocked to see Jing Liuli appear with a thin branch holding up an entire osmanthus tree. There was a loud boom. Before they could adjust to this scene, Jing Liuli's thin branch had already fallen in front of the carriage. This thin branch easily shattered the carriage and then continued to gently hold up the falling osmanthus tree. The clump of soil was still a clump of soil. It was lightly placed at the bottom of the carriage, and not even a piece of soil fell off. The most important thing when using the sword is the result. Not all direct attacks mean that everything will go as you wish. As long as each attack is free, the final result will also be free. Ding Ning looked in satisfaction at Jing Liuli and sat down. He sat in front of the tree. Because there was no soil, the place where he sat was still very clean. Chapter 373. The carriage returned to Ink Garden. Jing Liuli had not rested for many days, but along the way, she was in a wondrous state. She seemed to have forgotten her exhaustion. Her body seemed to be emitting a layer of faint fluorescent light. This layer of fluorescent light was like a peerless sword that gradually became less dazzling and more lustrous after its initial sharpness was revealed. She and Ding Ning were important people in Chongling at this time. Along the way, the gazes of many powerful cultivators would linger on her and Ding Ning. Naturally, some of them could detect this subtle change in energy. These people started to be shocked. They could not understand what had happened in the osmanthus forest in Palace Commander Lu's compound. What had caused Jing Lioli to suddenly change like this? They looked at the osmanthus tree placed peacefully on the carriage, and a large ball of evenly cut soil at the base of the osmanthus tree. Many people did not understand how Jing Lioli had done it. Yet they were certain that Jing Lioli's change in presence from when she first entered Chongling, especially when she was in a state of epiphany, was because of Ding Ning. Sometimes I really have to be convinced. A youth stood in an alley and looked at the carriage returning to Ink Garden. His gaze grew more respectful. In the end, he bowed seriously towards the carriage. This youth was also on the Book of Talents, but his ranking was not high enough. In the Min Mountain Sword Trials, he had been eliminated before he reached the end of the trials. At this time, Jing Lioli and Ding Ning did not even notice his existence, but he bowed so seriously to Ding Ning and Jing Lioli out of pure admiration and respect. Youths of his age usually worshipped heroes more. While he had been a competitor in the Min Mountain Sword Trials, after the trials, Ding Ning, who had fought for his sect and now avenged Shui Wangshu, was a hero in his eyes. His attitude naturally represented the attitude of most of the young people in Chongling. Jing Lioli did not make a sound the entire way. When the carriage carried the osmanthus tree into Ink Garden, the faint glow on Jing Lioli's body gradually disappeared. Then she turned her head and looked at Ding Ning, who was sitting calmly. She asked, "What is in the soil under this tree?" The others did not understand Ding Ning's actions. They only thought that entering the osmanthus forest and digging up this osmanthus flower had something to do with Jing Lioli's cultivation. However, based on all the previous details, Jing Lioli was certain that there was something very important to Ding Ning in the soil under the osmanthus flower tree. It was related to his breakthrough in cultivation. Ding Ning raised his head to look at her. Before he could say anything, Jing Lioli had already understood the meaning in his eyes. She directly said on behalf of Ding Ning, "I will know in the future, right?" Ding Ning could not help but smile slightly. Then he nodded and said, "I think what you need to consider the most right now is not my matter." Jing Lioli also glanced at him and said, "Do you still need me to make medicine for you? Let's talk about it in 3 days." Ding Ning shook his head. Jing Lioli made a sound of acknowledgement. She looked at the osmanthus tree behind Ding Ning and said, "You will take care of it yourself?" Ding Ning nodded and said, "I will take care of it myself." Jing Lioli did not say anything else. When the carriage stopped at the door to the little courtyard in the deepest part of Ink Garden, she walked down from the carriage and then walked towards her own room to rest without looking back. Ding Ning knew her personality. He did not look at Jing Lioli, who had not yet entered the room. He also got off the carriage and looked quietly at the osmanthus tree. Many of the osmanthus tree's roots had been damaged, and the roots that went deep into the soil had all been cut off. It was already difficult for it to survive this year, let alone bloom. However, many years ago, this osmanthus tree was the one that bloomed the most in the entire forest. Many years ago, a certain person met a certain woman from Jiaodong Commandery in this osmanthus forest. That person was stunned by the woman's beauty and talent, and the woman fell in love with that person at first sight. That person thought that he could spend a lifetime with that woman. Later, that person made many friends who appreciated each other and often came to the wine shop in this osmanthus forest to drink. Drinking wine and fighting the world. Everything seemed so perfect. One day, the man suddenly had an idea. He stole the best jug of newly brewed wine in the wine shop. He added some elixirs that could make the wine taste even better. Then, he buried the jug of wine under the most beautiful osmanthus tree. Time waited for the wine to mature. That person wanted to wait until his wedding with that woman to secretly take out this jug of wine and give that wine shop owner and all his close friends a surprise. But before the wine had matured, the person was gone. That woman from Jiaodong Commandery became the mistress of Chongling and the empress of the Qin dynasty. That person and many of his friends all died in battle in Chongling. That wine shop also disappeared. Many more important things could not be remembered, much less this jug of wine that was just a sudden idea, an insignificant addition to perfection. This was a jug of wedding wine that had long been forgotten. Maybe if nothing had changed back then, this jug of wine might not have been remembered by anyone. But because of revenge, this jug of wine appeared again. Ding Ning attacked. The tip of the last flower remnant sword split into countless sword threads and softly sank into the soil under the osmanthus tree. These sword threads silently wrapped around a gray wine jug sleeping in the soil, and then pulled the wine jug out of the soil. The sword energy given off by the sword threads swept away all obstacles. Countless white flowers floated in the fine soil. The wine jug was not small. It was enough for dozens of people to drink a bowl each. The jug was sealed well, and not even a hint of alcohol came out. That person pursued the extreme in everything he did, but could not think of the future. There was a soft snap. Ding Ning broke the seal with a wave of his hand. There was only half a jar of golden wine left now. Ding Ning looked up. Even more things that had already disappeared from his memory, and the faces of some people flashed through his mind. "To all of you," he said softly. He put away his sword, held up the wine jug with one hand, and poured the wine into his mouth. He drank in large mouthfuls. The taste of this jug of wine was wonderful. The best osmanthus wine of the past merged with the fragrance of those spirit medicines. It was sweet and felt like it was burning in his throat. Even the legendary immortal wine could not compare to this. But at this time, Ding Ning's mouth tasted even more bitter than when he had drunk those medicinal soups. Back then, those spirit medicines were purely for fragrance and taste. For that person and that person's friends, the benefits to their cultivation were minuscule. But for his present cultivation, it was so important. Balls of strong airflow spread along with the drunkenness, constantly exploding in his body and rushing into his sea of qi. Almost everyone liked the fragrance of osmanthus. Deep in the imperial palace, the woman from Jiaodong Commandery sat on the phoenix chair. She listened to the report of the middle-aged, yellow-robed cultivator outside the door. Her perfect head slowly looked up, and her emotionless gaze landed on the garden outside through a side window. There were many tall osmanthus trees there, but other than a hint of surprise, her gaze was still cold and emotionless. She did not understand why Ding Ning and Jing Lioli had gone to the osmanthus forest to dig up an osmanthus tree. Because it was too far away. Because so far away, many things in the past were too insignificant. She had long forgotten where they had met, as it had long been quietly erased from her memory by the passage of time. She had long forgotten that osmanthus forest. Chapter 374. In the morning, the sound of horse hooves sounded in the quiet streets. In Chongling, it was normal for carriages to pass through the streets. Yet this sound came from Engarden. Many cultivators who were usually well-trained suddenly raised their heads and looked towards the source of the voice. Soon, the carriage appeared in their line of sight. The driver was still Jing Lioli. 3 days ago, she had dug out an osmanthus tree from the osmanthus forest of that palace general. She had shattered the carriage with one blow and transported the osmanthus tree back to Engarden. Now this carriage did not have a cabin. Ding Ning seemed to be sitting on a handcart without any cover. Yet no one found it laughable. They just felt shock and unease. Because every time this carriage came out of Engarden, it would do something that would shock all of Chongling. There was a Taoist temple in the north of Chongling. There were many large yellow poplars in front of the door. Few people came to this Taoist temple usually, but as the carriage from Engarden came closer, this Taoist temple suddenly fell into the sight of everyone in Chongling. Jing Lioli's carriage stopped in front of this Taoist temple. Then she immediately frowned. The black doors of the Taoist temple were slightly ajar, but no one came out to greet them. Jing Lioli frowned not because of herself, but because she knew that the Taoist in this temple should know her identity. From a certain point of view, she represented Min Mountain Sword Sect. Many carriages and people followed behind the carriage. The sound of people grew louder around this quiet Taoist temple, but the inside of the temple was still silent. Not even footsteps could be heard. Ding Ning sat on the carriage and had yet to get off. Everyone's gaze landed on him. They were speculating about his goal in coming here, and what he would do next. Jing Lioli still frowned. She turned to look at Ding Ning, who was sitting silently on the carriage. She thought that she should speak in this situation. But if the people in the temple still played dead after she spoke, and no one paid attention, she did not know how to respond. Not knowing how to deal with it was an extremely embarrassing thing for her. Just as she turned around, Ding Ning raised his head. He looked at the tall boxwood tree with its branches and leaves covering his head. He reached out to his side and picked up a wine pouch. There was really wine in the wineskin. When Ding Ning raised his head to drink, Jing Lioli smelled the strong aroma of the wine. The aroma made her feel very comfortable and even made her want to drink the wine. But at this moment, Ding Ning said, "The boxwood must have been here when the Taoist temple was built, right?" There seemed to be an invisible magic in his voice, and Jing Lioli subconsciously followed his gaze. The morning sun shone through the gaps between the leaves, making her squint her eyes slightly. This was indeed a very old and tall boxwood tree. Things that were very old naturally had a unique sense of beauty. However, the reason why she narrowed her eyes slightly was because she felt Ding Ning's murderous aura. "Chop down this tree." Ding Ning put down the wine pouch, licked the corners of his mouth and smiled, showing rare, white teeth. Then he said softly, "If no one comes out, chop down all of these boxwood trees." Jing Lioli's eyes lit up slightly. She had learned how to deal with such situations in the future. She nodded and got off the carriage. Her body started to release a type of strange, faint fluorescent light. She reached out her right hand as if she wanted to stroke the boxwood in front of her. However, the instant the light at the edge of her palm touched this boxwood, a ring of faint light also appeared on this boxwood tree's trunk. In the next moment, this yellow poplar tree was like a drunkard, falling crookedly towards the yellow poplar tree next to it. The branches and leaves rubbed against each other, emitting countless sounds that were not loud but made the heart palpitate. Jing Lioli looked at the fallen boxwood tree and felt it was a pity. But for some reason, when she smelled the scent of wine, she felt very happy. Without any hesitation, under everyone's shocked gazes, she walked towards a nearby boxwood tree. When have these trees offended you? At this moment, a long sigh came from the Taoist temple. Jing Lioli's eyebrows rose slightly and her steps paused. But at this time, Ding Ning's voice reached her ears again. "Chop!" Jing Lioli's gaze flashed. Without hesitation, she waved her hand again. The boxwood tree in front of her fell with a crash. 2 boxwood trees suddenly fell in front of the temple, and the place immediately became empty. The temple door was pushed open from the inside with a bang. An old Taoist stood at the door. His face had been very pale, but now it was even paler. "These boxwood trees were personally planted by my grandmaster more than 300 years ago." The pale old Taoist's beard trembled slightly. He looked at Jing Lioli and Ding Ning. "I do not know what you want to do." Ding Ning looked calmly at him and then at his waist. Then he shook his head and said coolly, "You have a sword, so you should know what I want to do." Jing Lioli frowned again. She saw that the pale old Taoist's sleeves were very wide, so the scabbard at his waist was covered by only a small part of it. It was a small part of the scabbard that looked like white jade. From this, one could imagine how small the sword inside would be. This pale old Taoist was Taoist Qian. Hearing Ding Ning's calm words, his gaze landed on the 2 fallen boxwood trees. Looking at the scattered leaves on the ground, his body started to tremble slightly. He said, "You go too far. Do not use such a clumsy method." Ding Ning smiled disdainfully and said, "If you really want to hide, you can close the temple and hide further away." You waited at the empty door, and your sword essence came out. You wanted to kill me for her for a long time. You are so old. You should have seen through many things. 2 boxwood trees would not cause you such pain. You made people feel that I went too far, and you were forced to act. Such a clumsy method is meaningless. Jing Lioli listened silently. Thinking of the details Ding Ning mentioned, her expression grew more disdainful. When Ding Ning finished speaking, she snorted disdainfully. "Shameless old thing." Taoist Qian's expression had already stiffened. Hearing Jing Lioli's snort, his expression immediately grew ugly. In the span of a single breath, the trembling of his body completely stopped, and a cold and callous smile appeared at the corner of his mouth. You really? He looked at Ding Ning and said softly, emphasizing each word, want to force me to kill you? Ding Ning looked at the cruel smile at the corners of his mouth and also smiled. He did not directly respond to his words and said softly, you should have a senior sect brother. Originally, this temple should belong to him, but now this temple belongs to you because that palace attendant is your disciple. So just based on this, I have a reason to kill you. Daoist Qian took a deep breath. He did not say anything else. He looked up at Ding Ning and said, I accept your challenge. His voice was loud and clear, and everyone within a radius of several hundred feet could hear him. Jing Liuli turned. As she walked behind Ding Ning, she asked softly, you really plan to kill him? Ding Ning glanced at her and said, he has a reason to die. If he wants to kill me, then I will kill him. Daoist Qian had not heard Ding Ning and Jing Liuli's conversation, but he could sense Ding Ning's confidence. Actually, even without her, I want to try and see if I can kill you based on your present attitude. He put away his cold smile and said seriously to Ding Ning, I've lived for so long in Chongling and seen so many powerful cultivators, but I have never seen a cultivator of your cultivation who has the confidence to kill a cultivator like me. Just this curiosity alone is enough for me to give it a try. In other words, it is because of my disciple that limits my thoughts. If I lose to you and die at your hands, what kind of effect will it have on her? Daoist Qian paused and then looked at Ding Ning. He said, as a swordsman of Chongling, this kind of temptation is hard to resist. Even if I die at your hands, I fear this battle will be recorded in the history books. Then I will let you record it in the history books. Ding Ning laughed and said, because your cultivation is much stronger than mine, I will not be modest. I will fight first, please. The moment the word please sounded, Ding Ning had already made his move. He gripped the hilt of the last flower's sword and stabbed forward. Daoist Qian was not surprised. The flying sword he cultivated focused on speed. He had predicted that Ding Ning would attack first. Even if Ding Ning attacked first, he did not think that Ding Ning could get the first move. When Ding Ning gripped the hilt of the last flower sword, there was a vibration at his waist. A small sword hidden in the white jade scabbard flew out of the scabbard. But at this time, to his disbelief, he felt a sword essence appear next to him, one completely different from Ding Ning's. Chapter 375. This sword essence did not give him a strong feeling, but it was exceptionally dangerous. In this short period of time, he understood why this sword essence made him feel so dangerous. Because this sword essence came from Jing Liuli. Jing Liuli was the direct disciple of the master of Min Mountain Sword Sect, Bailey Sushue. He cultivated the best sword of Min Mountain Sword Sect, and his sword essence was not something ordinary Chongling swordsmen could compare to. But in a duel under the watchful eyes of so many people, could it be that they could cheat and fight two against one? Daoist Qian could not understand. He could not help but glance at the source of the sword essence, or rather, his perception swept towards the source of the sword essence. But there was nothing there. There was only a tree stump, a boxwood stump that had just been cut and was still oozing juice. The sword essence came from the smooth surface, but it was just a thin sword essence without any true sword energy. Borrowing sword essence. Curtain sky, secret sword. Daoist Qian suddenly realized what was going on and exclaimed in shock. The reason for his exclamation was that he found he was too slow. Pew 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 pew. The sound of something breaking through the air even drowned out his cry of surprise. Ding Ning raised the last flower remnant sword, but what truly threatened Daoist Qian at this moment was the star-fiendish sword energy he had accumulated in his body. What was most terrifying about Daoist Qian was that his flying sword was faster than the flying swords of many Chongling swordsmen. So if he wanted to win against Daoist Qian, he had to pursue extreme speed. The moment Daoist Qian's perception was completely attracted by the sword essence, his right foot stepped hard on the stone pavement. The stone tiles under his foot immediately exploded. Using the powerful recoil, Ding Ning's body shot forward like an arrow. At the same time, all the fiendish sword energy he had accumulated in his body surged out. Like two extremely long black swords, they stabbed towards Daoist Qian's chest. Since he pursued extreme speed, he had already thought of what to do at every moment. The cold, fiendish sword energy rushed out of the meridians in his arms. While the muscles in his arms were still twitching and trembling, Ding Ning's right hand was already able to forcefully thrust forward. The same method seemed to be no different from when he dealt with Dr. AI. But Daoist Qian knew that compared to when Ding Ning dealt with Dr. AI, there was one more important secret sword. He had originally been much faster than Dr. AI, but because of that thin sword essence that did not cause any real damage, his reaction was even slower than Dr. AI's. Most importantly, he didn't have Dr. AI's defensive methods. Like all sword masters who were good at flying swords, close combat was his weakness. As he shouted, his expression changed dramatically. The thin flying sword that had charged forward a foot accurately swung between the two black sword lights and shattered all the fiendish swords. At the same time, his flying sword continued to move forward towards Ding Ning's right arm. While his talent was limited and his cultivation had not improved since the age of 40, he had spent many years of hard work on this flying sword. Even though he was shocked by Ding Ning's attack, he was still confident that he could defeat Ding Ning's sword before it landed on him, and even kill Ding Ning. Ding Ning's eyes were bright. His left hand swung out and unhesitatingly slapped at the flying sword. The tip of the sword pierced through his palm like tofu. A bright mist of blood rushed out of Ding Ning's hand. His left sleeve was completely wet. The sword gave off an ear-piercing sound of bone scraping. All the cultivators who saw this immediately paled. Daoist Qian's eyes narrowed slightly. All of this was within his expectations. In the next moment, this flying sword should have passed through Ding Ning's palm and cut through Ding Ning's right wrist that held the sword. However, in the next moment, he howled like a wild beast. His sword was unable to pass through Ding Ning's palm, but Ding Ning's last flower remnant sword had stabbed deep into his chest. The spreading sword threads immediately twisted his organs into mush. It was only at this moment that waves of shocked cries and screams rang out. Most of the spectators had seen many duels, but none had ever made them feel so bloody and cruel. As he howled, Daoist Qian, whose vital energy had completely dissipated, slapped his hands towards Ding Ning's face. Some of the rampaging vital energy was like lightning between his fingers. Ding Ning expressionlessly released his right hand. He bent down and burrowed into Daoist Qian's arms. His left hand slapped towards Daoist Qian's abdomen. His left hand held Daoist Qian's flying sword. Pew! 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 With each muffled sound of flesh being pierced, the hearts of the spectators contracted violently. In a breath, Ding Ning slapped Daoist Qian's energy multiple times. The tip of the sword stabbed into Daoist Qian's energy caused his vital energy to completely dissipate. Daoist Qian could not stand still. Under the recoil of the vital energy and energy flowing out of his energy sea, his body stumbled backwards. Ding Ning straightened his body. As blood sprayed, his eyes narrowed slightly. His left hand slapped towards Daoist Qian's throat without hesitation. Everyone heard a sound like a lantern shattering. Daoist Qian's beast-like howl suddenly stopped. There was only the sound of blood splattering and the sound of air leaking. There was not just a hole in his Adam's apple. His entire neck had caved in. Even now, Ding Ning's movements did not seem to have stopped in everyone's eyes. His right hand landed on his left palm. With a soft sound, he pulled out the flying sword in his left palm. Like throwing a dagger, he threw it towards the chest of the retreating Daoist Qian. Even though they saw the terrifying wounds on Daoist Qian's body and knew that Daoist Qian couldn't survive, when the flying sword accurately stabbed into his heart, everyone's hearts couldn't help but tremble. Ding Ning did not advance. He stopped. When he raised his right hand again, there was a piece of gauze in his hand to stop the bleeding. Then he used the same astounding speed to bandage his wound to stop the bleeding. The carriage had left in garden several times. Previously, he had not been wounded. However, even though he was injured this time, the scene at this moment was even more chilling than the previous few times. Deathly silence. There was only the sound of blood and the strange sounds coming from Daoist Qian's pierced throat. Daoist Qian clutched his throat in terror. He tried to open his mouth. At this time, he did not want to scream or make a sound of discontent. He wanted to send a message. Because he knew the truth. He knew why he would die. In the eyes of the other onlookers, Ding Ning had used a cruel method to block his flying sword with his palm bone for a moment. But only he knew that in that moment, countless strange forces had destroyed the vital energy he had attached to the flying sword. They seemed to be countless little silkworms. But in this moment, Ding Ning looked up. His calm and deep gaze caused Daoist Qian to freeze. Then Ding Ning took a step forward in front of him. You should understand the truth now. You did not die unjustly at my hands. Because I know not just your cultivation and swordsmanship, but also some of your instinctive fighting habits. You should understand now that I am not just avenging old man Shui. Hearing Ding Ning's almost unmoving voice, Daoist Qian's mouth opened even wider. He wanted to shout even more. However, he realized that he could no longer make any sound in that moment of stagnation. He looked in terror at Ding Ning, falling backwards and hitting the ground. Gasps and screams sounded. Only now did shock and terror start to spread. This was a true battle to the death, but the victor was still Ding Ning. How do you know the secret sword of Fang Ho Province? Jing Liuli did not have much shock in her eyes. Since Ding Ning had the confidence to come find this Taoist, she was certain that Ding Ning could win. There was only deep confusion in her eyes. That was not the secret sword of Fang Ho Province, but the secret sword of the Bazin Kendo ground. When Ding Ning turned around, she instinctively felt that Ding Ning would answer her with the most common sentence. You will know in the future. But Ding Ning's soft reply stilled her. We're going to the tea garden. But Ding Ning's next calm words truly shocked her. Go to the tea garden? She unconsciously repeated the words. As Ding Ning walked past her, he turned to look at her and said softly, What is worse than losing an important teacher and friend in one day is losing a lover, or watching that lover suffer pain worse than death. Chapter 376. Hearing Ding Ning's words, Jing Liuli did not say anything. But after glancing at Daoist Qian on the ground, she turned and said softly to Ding Ning, Is your attitude towards him too cold? You killed a person in front of so many people. You should know that most people in Chongling do not like the Empress because she is too cold. I may not be liked by most people in Chongling in the end. Ding Ning sat on the carriage and looked at his wounded left hand. He said seriously, I am very tired, so I cannot care about what these people think. Jing Liuli frowned slightly. She thought of Ding Ning's cultivation in these days, and his determination to use his hand to stop the sword just now. She bowed her head, stopped speaking, and started to drive. Palace attendant Rong stood under the eaves and waited. The summer sun shone on the golden roof tiles and was blinding. She knew that Ding Ning had gone to the Boxwood Temple. When the carriage left Ink Garden, she knew that something would happen today. Normally, she didn't think much of Daoist Qian. She had even forgotten about him, just like many young people who had left their hometown for a long time. When they grew older, they would slowly forget about their parents and relatives. But people could not truly be emotionless. Before Daoist Qian took her in as a disciple, she had been an orphan girl living on the streets. There were only two outcomes. Either she died on the streets, or she became a young prostitute in a brothel. Daoist Qian had not just taught her, but raised her. Just like how Daoist Qian had gradually forgotten her. When he saw Ding Ning, he immediately wanted to help her kill Ding Ning. When Ding Ning found Daoist Qian, the past favors, the guilt and kindness started to fill her body. She did not want anything to happen to Daoist Qian. The cicadas in the courtyard stopped chirping. Someone had come. A middle-aged cultivator in yellow robes appeared at the entrance to her courtyard and bowed slightly. Daoist Qian is dead. Palace attendant Rong's heart suddenly sank to an unknown place, as though it had fallen into an invisible abyss below her. The middle-aged cultivator in yellow robes slowly straightened his body. His eyes lit up. But palace attendant Rong's attention was not on him, so she did not detect his abnormality. The unusual light in the yellow-robed middle-aged cultivator's eyes quickly faded. He bowed his head and said, "That carriage did not return to Ink Garden, and is heading towards a tea garden." When palace attendant Rong heard the news of Daoist Qian's death, her body froze. But when she heard the yellow-robed middle-aged cultivator's words, she suddenly looked up in disbelief and exclaimed, "Why is it like this?" In the eyes of many people in Chongling who knew palace attendant Rong was an emotionless mud puppet, as cold as the Empress. People could not imagine such an exclamation coming from her. The yellow-robed middle-aged cultivator lowered his head and said, "The Empress does not want you to leave the palace." Palace attendant Rong's body and face froze again. Her face was bloodless, like the snowmen piled up in the winter in the palace. South of the city, tea garden. When Jing Liuli's carriage was heading towards the tea garden, a man wearing a bamboo hat and black silk robes was walking towards the tea garden from a small path. He was about a dozen miles away from this tea garden, separated by a bamboo forest and a small stream. There was a wooden bridge over the stream, which was covered with many green vines. The green vines even grew into the water, which made it look very watery. There was no one in this man's sight, but he suddenly sensed something and stopped. The moment he stopped, the bamboo hat on his head seemed to be cut by multiple sharp weapons, splitting apart and falling to the ground. Under the bamboo hat was a pampered face. His unusually clean and dark long hair was tied up with a white jade ring. His facial features were delicate, and it was hard to tell how old he was. Even his eyebrows seemed to have been trimmed. Not only did he look perfect, but he also gave off an unusually delicate feeling. "Do we really have to do this?" The man's delicate eyebrows raised slightly. The moment he opened his mouth to speak, a pure black longsword silently appeared in front of him. The sword was clearly very hard, but as it slowly flew around his body, it gave people a feeling of agility and softness. Sometimes the sword was in front of him, sometimes it was behind him, but no matter which angle one looked at it from, the pure black sword and the man gave off a feeling that they were impenetrable. "It does not have to be like this." Xiao Sharon's voice sounded. Before his voice sounded, there was no one on that wooden bridge covered in green vines. However, when his voice sounded, his figure already appeared on that wooden bridge. "As long as you stop here and wait for the tea garden matter to finish, it does not have to be like this." Xiao Sharon looked at this man and said expressionlessly, "You are very good at killing." The black-robed man narrowed his eyes at Xiao Sharon. He shook his head and said, "But you may not be a match for me." Xiao Sharon looked coldly at him and said, "I will not think about who is a match for whom. I only know that either I kill or I am killed." After a pause, Xiao Sharon looked at the bamboo hat fragments at the man's feet. Faint disdain and provocation appeared at the corners of his mouth. "Su Fanqin, if you were so confident, your bamboo hat would not have been broken." The black-robed man smiled with a hint of pride. He looked at him and said, "Maybe I did it on purpose." Xiao Sharon's gaze darkened. He looked coldly at the moving black sword of the black-robed man and said, "You know I do not like to joke, so you can try." The black-robed man's smile disappeared. His eyebrows rose, but he did not speak. The black sword only moved and did not move forward. "Actually, we do not have much meaning here." Many breaths later, the black-robed man shook his head and said. Xiao Sharon glanced at him and said, "There is no meaning because that carriage will enter the tea garden in the end, because she is the only one who does not want that carriage to enter the tea garden. But many people in Chongling want that carriage to enter the tea garden." The carriage was close to the tea garden. For Jing Liuli, this carriage had a smooth journey from the Boxwood Temple to here without any obstruction. Just like the last time he came to the tea garden, Ding Ning got off the carriage outside the tea garden and then walked along the fields towards the bamboo hut. The master of the tea garden, the quiet middle-aged man, Zhang Liang, was carrying water. Seeing Ding Ning and Jing Liuli walk over, he put down his burden and nodded in greeting to Ding Ning and Jing Liuli. Ding Ning nodded in return and then said, "You lied. Daoist Qian is dead." I killed him. Now, I will challenge you. Chapter 377. Zhang Liang's body froze slightly. He struggled to lift his head, his face gradually paling. When Ding Ning said that Daoist Qian was dead, Ding Ning's expression was still calm, as though he had done something insignificant. This kind of expression made him feel that he was insignificant to Ding Ning, and even powerless to argue. When did you feel that I was lying? He paused for a long time before looking at Ding Ning and speaking. Ding Ning looked at him and said, "From the beginning, no one usually came to the tea garden on the river. As Jing Lioli and Ding Ning came, large groups of people followed. Even some ordinary Chongling people came, while the crowd deliberately lowered their voices. For Zhang Liang, who usually lived in a quiet environment, the surrounding voices grew louder and made his head swell. He did not believe that Ding Ning could kill Daoist Qian, but these people who surrounded the tea garden, the expressions on their faces, the buzzing voices that filled his ears constantly reminded him that this was the truth. Daoist Qian was dead. If he died on the same day, what would happen to her? He suddenly understood Ding Ning's thoughts. "You are too vicious." His body started to tremble, not letting a dying old man see the last. That is the greatest viciousness. Ding Ning did not look at his face, looking up at the distant mountains, and slowly said. Hearing Ding Ning's words, Zhang Liang's body stopped trembling, but he grew colder. "I will not accept your challenge." In Chongling, a swordsman, especially one with higher cultivation, will not dare to accept another's challenge. They will be looked down upon and spurned. It seems that for her, you can even disregard your reputation and what other people think of you. Ding Ning looked calmly at Zhang Liang and shook his head with slight disdain. "But will she treat you like this?" Zhang Liang took a deep breath, looked at Ding Ning, and said, "Yes, that's just what you think." Ding Ning glanced at him and said, "I can make a bet with you." Zhang Liang asked, "What bet?" Ding Ning looked at him indifferently and said, "I bet that she won't come here even if I wait until sunset. If she gets here before sunset, I will give up on challenging you." Zhang Liang said after a moment of silence, "Not everyone is free. I agree with you." Ding Ning looked at the distant walls of Chongling and said, "No one is free. The key is what kind of sacrifice each person is willing to make." "You have no confidence in her." Ding Ning paused, then looked into his eyes and said, "If you are as confident as I am, then you dare to bet with me." Zhang Liang paled even more. He looked up at Ding Ning and said, "If she comes before sunset, unless you also give up on challenging her." His words were messy, but Ding Ning and Jing Lioli understood his meaning. Jing Lioli felt that Zhang Liang's words were powerful, so she could not help but look up at Ding Ning. Unexpectedly, Ding Ning did not hesitate. He smiled and said, "All right, if she comes before sunset, I will give up on challenging her." Zhang Liang's eyes lit up for a moment. But for some reason, looking at Ding Ning's calm and confident expression, his heart suddenly sank. Then he was silent for a long time. Then he knelt on the ground, facing Ding Ning. The tea garden was in an uproar. No one understood why the master of the tea garden would suddenly kneel to Ding Ning. Jing Lioli was also shocked. In her view, since the wager was set, then both sides should wait for the result. Also, Ding Ning's attitude was so determined that even if Zhang Liang knelt and begged, Ding Ning would not change his mind. He is humiliating himself. Kneeling in front of us in front of so many people is naturally a great humiliation. At this time, Ding Ning's voice sounded. Ding Ning turned to look at the puzzled Jing Lioli and said, "If we are just calmly drinking tea and eating here, Palace Attendant Rome will not come. But he must have Palace Attendant Rome come." Jing Lioli immediately understood and said in a cold voice, "So he must let Palace Attendant Rome know that he is suffering the greatest humiliation. He does not care what the people of Chongling think of him, or what Palace Attendant Rome thinks of him. He just wants Palace Attendant Rome to come here. He wants Palace Attendant Rome to win the wager and not die at your hands in the future." Ding Ning was silent for a moment and said softly, very pitiful. Jing Lioli frowned. She inexplicably understood what Ding Ning meant. Palace attendant Rome would not come at all. From beginning to end, Zhang Liang had fallen in love with someone who was not worthy of his deep love. "I can help you again." Ding Ning walked in front of the kneeling Zhang Liang and said calmly, "I can let you endure such humiliation." Zhang Liang bowed his head. Although it was his own choice, countless voices filled his ears, and his body trembled because of the humiliation. He continued to kneel. Ding Ning continued to stand in front of him. It seemed to never stop. In the imperial palace, palace attendant Rong had been waiting under the eaves. The information about that carriage, after confirming that it was heading to the tea garden, continuously passed into her ears. At this time, she was very far from the tea garden. Her gaze could not pass through the imperial palace and half of Chongling to see the tea garden. Yet the information made her feel like she was outside the tea garden. She seemed to be able to see Zhang Liang kneeling in front of Ding Ning. Her body was trembling uncontrollably. Other than Jing Lioli, no one knew of the wager between Zhang Liang and Ding Ning. But she knew very well why Zhang Liang would endure such humiliation. She also knew that if she appeared in the tea garden and accepted Ding Ning's challenge, this matter would end. She still had the confidence to kill Ding Ning. But the Empress did not want her to appear in front of Ding Ning, did not want her to fight with Ding Ning. Her body trembled and her head was bowed. In the flower garden in front of her, the light slowly turned from golden to dark. Time silently passed. The scorching sun of summer slowly moved in the sky and gradually set in the west. Many people outside the tea garden grew impatient. In their vision, the middle-aged man in the tea garden was still kneeling in front of Ding Ning. They did not know how long he would kneel. Was he begging for forgiveness? What was he begging for Ding Ning's forgiveness for? These people could not understand. In the tea garden, Zhang Liang's face grew paler. For a cultivator like him, kneeling for an entire day and night would not be a problem. However, at this time, his sweat had soaked through his clothes and then was evaporated by the heat. His clothes were covered in a thick layer of salt frost. His stamina started to weaken. Chapter 378. Ding Ning turned his head and did not look at him. He looked at the people who were gradually becoming impatient. He looked at the setting sun until his face gradually darkened. She still hasn't come. He did not turn around and said to Zhang Liang, "I told you, she will not come." Zhang Liang looked up, his mouth open like a fish about to die of thirst as he looked at the last ray of sunlight in the sky. But even he knew the result, knew that she would not come. Why is it like this? The last light in his eyes seemed to disappear. Jean Lioli looked at this man. She felt pity for him and also pity him. Do not let him die. At this time, Ding Ning's voice reached her ears. Jing Lioli raised an eyebrow, still not understanding. But at this time, she sensed a sword essence. Zhang Liang was still kneeling, but his body had straightened. A sparkling sword light appeared in his hand, like the color of dew rolling on tea leaves in the morning. This sword light was not aimed at Ding Ning, but at his own heart. Jing Lioli understood the feeling of a dead heart. She stomped her feet. A blade of grass flew into the air, gently but with a majestic aura, striking the sword in Zhang Liang's hand. With a light clang, the sparkling and translucent sword light in Zhang Liang's hand was directly struck to the ground. The surroundings were in an uproar. The tired and impatient people in the tea garden saw this change and immediately gave off gasps. You lost not because you did not understand, but because you were not willing to believe. Is it worth dying like this? Ding Ning slowly turned around and looked calmly at Zhang Liang. He said, "Trapped in this tea garden is a prison for you. I do not believe that you have never thought of leaving here." Zhang Liang did not speak. It was impossible to see his expression in the darkness. Ding Ning did not look at him. He turned to look at Jing Lioli and said, "Let's go." Jing Lioli obediently followed him out of the tea garden like a true attendant. When the carriage started to slowly leave the tea garden, she could not help but ask Ding Ning softly, "Why did you have me save Zhang Liang? If he dies, he dies. It is straightforward." Ding Ning said softly in the darkness, but living is a kind of continuous torture. Jing Liuli thought and said, so you feel that Zhang Liyang's survival today has a greater effect on Palace Attendant Rong than his death? Yes. Ding Ning's response was unusually simple. When the carriage started to leave the tea garden, Palace Attendant Rong still stood under the eaves. She also heard the truth about what happened in the tea garden. She knew that Zhang Liang had not died and had survived. But inexplicably, when she heard that Zhang Liang's suicide had been stopped by Jing Liuli, she did not feel any joy. She felt her heart sink even deeper into the abyss. In the deeper abyss, there seemed to be a devil king who looked just like Ding Ning. At this time, he was grabbing her heart and eating it. Her body was empty and powerless. At this time, Chongling and the imperial palace seemed to be empty, as though there was nothing left. She seemed to have lost everything she had in Chongling. In truth, he shocked me. But if I were Bailey Sushue, I would have him return to Min Mountain Sword Sect and not let him rampage in Chongling. When they left in the darkness, the black-robed man looked seriously at Xiao Sharon on the wooden bridge and said sincerely. Xiao Sharon knew what he meant, but just looked coldly at him and said, "You are not qualified to judge Bailey Sushue." The black-robed man's features suddenly turned cold. The black sword around him gave off strange hisses. But in the end, he turned and left without a word. On a river port not far from the black-robed man and Xiao Sharon, two women stood side by side. The faint mist drifting from the river's surface covered the two women like a thin veil. "This is Su Fanqin." Yi Sealing looked in the direction the black-robed man had disappeared and said to Bai Shanshui, in the past, he was a fisherman from Jiaodong Commandery. Zheng Xiu taught him the killing sword manual of the Bazin Kendo ground. Bai Shanshui smiled proudly and said, "So Zheng Xiu's top fighter looks like this." Yi Sealing corrected her. "The top assassin, not the top fighter. So he should be the one to ensure Liang Lian leaves Chongling." Bai Shanshui said coolly, "I will kill him. I have more and more confidence in him. I believe he will help me save the people in the great floating water prison. So I will do what I promised him and help him kill Liang Lian. What are you thinking about?" The carriage moved through the streets of Chongling. Just like usual, Ding Ning did not speak much. But today, Jing Liuli felt Ding Ning was exceptionally silent. In about half a month, I will have the ability to defeat Palace Attendant Rong. In reality, I do not want her to come find me during this time. Ding Ning said. Jing Liuli frowned. "You will reach Realm 5 in so many days?" Ding Ning ignored her words and said softly, "I am thinking about Wang Taishu and my senior sect brother. Wang Taishu took a detour, and I may have just arrived." Jing Liuli turned to look at him and said, "Zhang, should have arrived some time ago. Celestial Seal Sect." The moon in the sky was clearly reflected in the water of an ancient well. Zhang put down his water load and looked at the moon reflected in the water. He looked at his face in the water and gradually felt ashamed and dazed. In the Celestial Seal Sect exam, his performance had been mediocre. Even he did not understand why he could pass the exam and become a disciple of Celestial Seal Sect. After entering Celestial Seal Sect to study, his performance was still mediocre. Many times, he could not complete some of the homework set by his teachers and was often punished. Just like today, because he made a mistake in even the simplest seal character and accidentally broke several water jars, he was punished to carry water for all of Celestial Seal Sect's water jars. Thinking of his junior sect brother who had been so awe-inspiring at the Min Mountain Sword Trials, he felt comforted. He missed him and felt even more ashamed. The great senior sect brother of White Goat Cave, someone who even entered the top 10 of the Min Mountain Sword Trials, has fallen to such a state. Are you unsuited to the yin, or unsuited to Celestial Seal Sect? A voice sounded. Zhang Yi suddenly shook. He felt this voice was very familiar. Looking in the direction of the voice, he stilled when he saw the person in the darkness. Looking at the person's clothing, he stilled for a long moment and said in disbelief, "Su Qin, you are also here? The world is too small. I came to Celestial Seal Sect. I had not expected you to also come to Celestial Seal Sect." The person in the darkness looked at Zhang Yi and smiled. But I seem to be more suited to Celestial Seal sect than you, so I am a disciple who can enter true Seal Hall. Chapter 379. Zhang Yi did not dare to believe it. He rubbed his eyes, but the scene in front of him did not change at all. Su Qin just stood there, dressed in the robes of Celestial Seal sect. But compared to his robes, there were several seal scripts embroidered in black thread at the collar and cuffs. You must want to know why I am in the yin, and you must be thinking, with my crippled body, how can I become a disciple of Celestial Seal sect? Looking at Zhang Yi's disbelieving gaze, Su Qin laughed in pleasure. He raised his crippled hand that looked especially vicious and at odds with his figure and face. He looked disdainfully at Zhang Yi and said, I can tell you the reason. Because of the Empress. Empress? Zheng Xiao? Zhang Yi did not dare to believe it, but he knew that the Empress Su Qin spoke of could not be the Empress of the Yin dynasty. It could only be that cold mistress of Chongling. Su Qin nodded and looked up at the night sky above Zhang Yi's head. It was as if the moonlight and starlight in the night were somewhat dazzling to him. He narrowed his eyes slightly. I can tell you that Li Lingjun was able to become emperor of the Chu, and I was able to leave the Chu and become a disciple of Celestial Seal sect are all related to her. You were able to come here because of the arrangements of the old Chongling families. After a pause, Su Qin looked disdainfully at Zhang Yi and said slowly, the reason I tell you this is because I want you to understand that she is much stronger than you imagine. The cultivators in Chongling say that she controls the order of Chongling, but in reality, the further one goes out of Chongling, the more one will understand how terrifying she is. Do not think that by coming here, you can completely escape her control. Even if you come to a blessed land, do not think that the old Chongling families will help you for no reason without asking for anything in return. Zhang Yi looked dazedly at Su Qin. He started to sweat uncontrollably and soaked his clothing. His hands began to tremble uncontrollably. He did not dare to think. If even Li Lingjuan's return to the Chu to become emperor had been arranged by Empress Zheng Xiao, if her intentions could affect the Yin dynasty's Celestial Seal sect, then what would happen to the Chu, Yin, and Liang dynasties in the future? So even that person died at her hands. Su Qin looked at the pale Zhang Yi and said with slight disdain, so I think the most terrifying person in Chongling is Zheng Xiao, and not the emperor who calls himself the Lonely One. What do you mean? Zhang Yi composed himself and looked at Su Qin. Why are you telling me all this? The mocking expression on Su Qin's face quickly expanded. He laughed out loud. The laughter gradually became somewhat mournful. His smile was as hideous as the scar on his hand. Because of hatred, because of unwillingness and obsession. My eldest sect brother, when I was in White Goat Cave, I always felt that a stupid person like you is not worthy of surpassing me. Why would you receive the favor of more sect uncles and junior sect brothers? If not for Ding Ning, I think you would never be a match for me in this life. Now that Ding Ning is not here, this is Celestial Seal sect. No one will disturb us. Hearing the words and the mournful laughter, and seeing Su Qin turn and walk into the darkness, Zhang Yi was stunned and instinctively shouted, but I do not want to compete with you. I want to. Su Qin did not turn around, but his voice sounded again into Zhang Yi's ears. Palace attendant Rong did not rest. She had been standing under the eaves of the corridor, looking at the heavy darkness pressing down on Chongling until the darkness gradually retreated and the dawn appeared in the eastern sky. She had been waiting for the latest news from the tea garden. In the end, there was no news. The person in the tea garden had left Chongling. Her body no longer trembled. Zhang Liang had not died. But inexplicably, not dying made her feel worse than dying. She knew that she had finally lost him completely. He no longer loved her. He no longer forgave her. He no longer accepted the excuses he had made for her. Daoist Qian was also dead. In this city, she finally had no family or friends left. Dawn was usually the time when one was the most tired. Even Jing Lioli had sunk into a deep sleep. Sitting cross-legged on the couch, Ding Ning opened his eyes. His door was only half closed, so it was easily pushed open from the outside. His gaze was still calm, but his heart immediately grew hot. Even if it was not the sound of footsteps, just the familiar scent told him that this was Zhangsun Qianxue. In this cold and majestic city, any meeting was worth cherishing. You may need it. I will lend it to you for now. The same cold voice sounded. A cold wind accompanied by a black shadow landed in front of him. Then Zhangsun Qianxue turned and walked out of his room. Ding Ning looked at the black shadow curled up in front of him. That was the black ice worm he was familiar with. But unlike the black ice worm he was familiar with, its body flashed with diamond-like light in the darkness. It had 2 horns on its head that it did not have before. In Chongling, Ding Ning rarely had a time when he was truly happy. But at this time, he was truly smiling happily. Not because of the change in this black ice worm, but because Zhangsun Qianxue had lent this black ice worm to him. This black ice worm was still very afraid of him and kept on trembling. Roosters crowed in the streets. All of Chongling slowly woke up. Jing Liuli also woke up. She finished washing in front of an old well in Ink Garden. Then she thought back to the things she had comprehended last night, before she slowly walked towards Ding Ning, who had just walked out of the bedroom. What are we doing today? She could not help but ask Ding Ning. Every time she drove the carriage out, she would gain something. So she was filled with anticipation for each day she cultivated here. When I came back last night, I saw a person wearing an unusual pair of shoes. Ding Ning smiled at her and said, I left 2 letters for him. So we do not have to do anything in the next few days. We just need to wait a dozen days. Jing Liuli frowned deeply. She had driven the carriage back last night, but she had not noticed anything. Who is it? Why did you leave letters for him? She looked at Ding Ning and asked these 2 questions. Ding Ning looked at her and answered directly, one of Wang Taishu's people. I glanced at him, and then when the carriage turned, I casually threw the 2 letters into the grass to the left. No one could see my actions from that position. Jing Liuli still frowned and asked, Then how are you so sure he can get your 2 letters? Because he is someone Wang Taishu left for me. Ding Ning smiled slightly and said, Since he is someone Wang Taishu left for me, and I looked at him meaningfully and to his left, he naturally should have gotten the 2 letters. Jing Liuli thought and decided to accept Ding Ning's explanation. Then she could not help but ask, What shoes did he wear? How come I did not notice anything different? Ding Ning laughed, the kind of laugh that he truly found funny. Wang Taishu told me that he would leave someone for me. That person's shoes are different from others. I have always wondered what the difference was. When I saw it, I realized what was different. Ding Ning could not help but laugh. He was wearing Wang Taishu's shoes, the shoes that Wang Taishu wore when he last saw me. Even if the shoes fit, Wang Taishu would not be afraid of infecting him with athlete's foot. Jing Liuli was stunned. She felt that the matter itself was very funny, but she was not a person who would laugh at a joke. So her expression became more serious. So it is not a problem with my observation skills. It is because other than you, I am afraid that no one else can see what is so special about his shoes. Ding Ning nodded and could not help but laugh. That is just an ordinary pair of old shoes that may have athlete's foot. Then who are the 2 letters for? Jing Liuli's brows relaxed and she asked seriously. One is for her, telling her what she needs to help me do. The other is for an important person in Chongling. I have something I need her to do for me. Ding Ning looked at her and said. Jing Liuli thought and said, So you mean you used your last resort against Palace Attendant Rome? You are only waiting for your cultivation to have a breakthrough in a dozen days, and Palace Attendant Rome cannot resist coming out to find you? Ding Ning glanced at her and thought that this was not the case. But for the first time, he did not mean what he said. That is what I mean. Chapter 380. A pair of black calfskin shoes stepped on a caterpillar that had fallen from a tree. The owner of the shoes seemed to feel slightly dirty and itchy. After raising his foot, he twisted his toes on the stone path in front of him. This pair of shoes looked ordinary, but the leather was soft and thin. It would be comfortable to wear. In another alley, a middle-aged man was looking sharply in the direction of Ink Garden. Suddenly, He felt an inexplicable sense of threat. This feeling was similar to when a poisonous snake suddenly appeared behind him when he was hiding in the grass and watching the enemy cavalry. This feeling had appeared once before, so he felt that it was not a coincidence. He turned around. He was on the second floor of the tea house. Behind him was a staircase. There was no one on the staircase. In this moment, his face paled. He suddenly sensed clearly that this feeling of danger came from the teapot that had been in front of him, but was now behind him. He opened his mouth, wanting to let out a shrill scream. However, faster than his vital energy, the teapot that had been calmly placed on the tea tray shook slightly. A drop of water flew out of the mouth of the teapot, elongating into a sword, easily piercing through the back of his neck and entering his brain. His eyes suddenly widened, filled with blood, and his body froze. No one in the tea house detected anything unusual on the second floor. Among the customers on the first floor, there were subordinates of this middle-aged man, but even they did not sense anything unusual. However, behind the wall of this tea house, in another alley, a tall and slender woman carrying a basket of flowers was walking past. She was selling flowers. This woman's clothes were very simple and elegant. For some reason, the people who walked past her couldn't see her face clearly. The news of the middle-aged man's death immediately reached the main tent of the Tiger and Wolf Army. A young man in casual clothing knelt on one knee and described in detail all the details of the middle-aged man's death, including his own speculations, to Liang Lian, who was sitting cross-legged in the center of the tent. Liang Lian looked coldly at this young man. There was true coldness in his eyes. He didn't like subordinates who added too much of their own emotions and speculations when reporting. Moreover, he also knew that after the military counselor who had followed him for many years was killed by him, this young man was too eager to show off and wanted to become his new military counselor. But even though he did not like this young man, he still had enough tolerance, because the other was loyal to him. The one who killed the left general cannot be Bai Shanshui. He shook his head and looked at the young man whose expression had stiffened because of his denial. He said slowly, "Even at my peak, I cannot kill the left general silently." The young man did not know that his judgment that Liang Lian thought was childish was actually correct. Hearing Liang Lian's words, he paled and thought he understood something. This wine shop youth is now a member of Min Mountain Sword Sect. The people of Min Mountain Sword Sect are famed for protecting their own. They are known to be protective, and only those people of Min Mountain Sword Sect have such strength. Liang Lian stood up and slowly walked out of the tent. He coughed and looked at the city walls of Chongling. He said coldly, "Many people want to force me to leave Chongling quickly. I can ignore them, but I cannot ignore Min Mountain Sword Sect." In the south suburbs of the city, in the tea garden, after Ding Ning left that day, most people in Chongling wanted to know what happened to the middle-aged tea master who had knelt for a day in the tea garden. Especially when most people in Chongling learned that the middle-aged tea master and palace attendant Rong who had forced Shui Wangshu to his death were secret lovers. But speculation was speculation. Palace attendant Rong and the matter itself were too important for most people in Chongling. So after Ding Ning left, no one dared to enter the tea garden to look. On this day, an ignorant farmer driving an ox cart entered the tea garden. He was an old acquaintance of Zhang Luyang. He raised chickens and geese in the outskirts of Chongling and would deliver fertilizer to this tea garden several times a year. Because he was not in Chongling, he did not know what had happened here. When he entered the tea garden, this farmer found that Zhang Luyang's bamboo hut was uninhabited. The ashes in Zhang Luyang's stone stove appeared to have been cold for a long time, and not recently. The farmer was puzzled. He looked around, and when he came to the pond where Zhang Luyang washed her clothes and washed her rice, he was stunned for a moment. Then, he couldn't help but let out a cry of surprise. He saw many white bones. These white bones were just ordinary goose bones. The remaining meat on the bones had been eaten clean by the ants, but these fine, white bones were arranged in a row on the ground. This row of white bone words spelled out a date. This farmer thought, that was a day 3 years before the Yuanwu emperor ascended the throne. He clearly remembered that 3 days after this day would be the day of the late emperor's death. This farmer found it strange that he could not find Zhang Luyang. He went out of the garden to ask about Zhang Luyang. When he heard what had happened here a few days ago, he was in disbelief. Then he casually mentioned the row of white bone words that puzzled him. No one could solve his confusion. Everyone who heard felt that Zhang Luyang might have left behind this row of white bone words. They wanted to say something, but no one knew what this date meant. But palace attendant Rong knew. Or rather, in all of Chongling, only she and the empress knew. When the news of the tea garden reached her courtyard in the imperial palace, she, who was no longer standing under the eaves, but sitting woodenly by the window, could not help but tremble. She clearly remembered this date, because on that day, that person had returned and spent a night with the empress in a courtyard in Chongling. The empress trip had been very secretive. She had arranged it, and only she knew. At that time, the empress had been together with the Yuanwu emperor. She had been preparing to start a mutiny against that person in the Bazinkindo ground. That night, the empress had been very affectionate towards that person. But that night, the Yuanwu emperor did not know. That date represented that day. Many other things could have happened, but she naturally thought of that night, because she knew that the empress would naturally associate it with that kind of night. That person was dead. How could Zhang Liang know what happened that night? Palace attendant Rong's body trembled. Her clothing started to be soaked with sweat. She knew that she would not talk in her sleep, but at this time, she started to suspect that she really talked in her sleep. She did not dare to believe that even if Zhang Liang knew what happened that night, he would use such a method to take revenge on her. Yet she was certain that the empress would feel that the words Zhang Liang left behind represented that night. What does he mean? Yi Sealing walked tiredly back to his little courtyard and looked at the flower girl sitting comfortably on the bamboo chair. He seems to mean to deal with Liang Lian and palace attendant Rong at the same time. Bai Shanshui smiled at Yi Sealing and said, "Everything seems to have become more interesting." Chapter 381. Such a crazy woman. Yi Sealing looked at the arrogant Bai Shanshui and could not help but frown and say coldly, regardless of whether Ding Ning's plan was perfect or not, in this plan, Bai Shanshui had to deal with Su Fanqin alone. She was the strongest swordsman in Jiaodong Commandery other than the empress. You speak as though you are not a crazy woman. Bai Shanshui's smile grew brighter. Yi Sealing sat down on the bamboo chair next to her. He bowed his head, and a dazed emotion flashed through his eyes. Ding Ning's style of conduct caused her to think of that person more and more, and she found him more and more familiar. That person's plans were often flawless and advanced step by step. His final failure was because he had mistakenly believed some people from the start. Empress Zhengxiu was used to leaving behind a backup plan for everything she did, and that person was used to killing two birds with one stone. He would calculate many people in one matter, and often, people would not be able to connect the dots. Not just cultivation methods that can be passed down, but even methods of conduct can be passed down, and so many years after you died. Yi Sealing thought. She started to feel that her thoughts were crazy, and she was a crazy woman. After killing Daoist Qian and entering the tea garden to make palace attendant Rong's secret lover kneel in front of him for a day, everyone in Chongling waited for the carriage from Ink Garden to leave again. The Deer Mountain Conference had ended, Yangshan Commandery had been taken back, and the Min Mountain Sword Trials had ended. For the time being, there did not seem to be any major events in the Qin dynasty. Ding Ning's revenge had become the biggest show of the Qin dynasty in the summer. Yet to everyone's surprise, before the Ink Garden carriage left Ink Garden, a carriage of sufficient weight came to Ink Garden. This carriage came from Fenghe province. Ding Ning did not ask. He left Ink Garden and boarded the carriage. Jing Lioli followed him like a true attendant and sat next to him. This time, even if Ding Ning did not explain, Jing Lioli knew why the carriage from Fenghe province had come. When Ding Ning killed Daoist Qian, the borrowing sword essence he used to defeat Daoist Qian did not come from White Goat Cave or Min Mountain Sword Sect, but from Fenghe province. Min Mountain Sword Sect would investigate every student participating in the Min Mountain Sword Trials, and the bureaus would cooperate. In the information of Min Mountain Sword Sect, Ding Ning had no contact with Feng Ho province before this. So how did Ding Ning know the secret swords of Feng Ho province? This carriage did not head towards Feng Ho province. Instead, it headed towards a remote and desolate courtyard. Ding Ning was very calm, because he could be said to be more familiar with every street and alley in Chongling than anyone else. He even knew what kind of people lived in most of the houses. That remote and desolate courtyard was where Feng Shimu had secluded himself to cultivate. When the door opened, a thick medicinal smell caused Jing Liuli to unconsciously stop breathing. She had boiled medicine for Ding Ning for a long time, but even the ferocious medicine could not compare to this medicinal smell. This medicinal smell seemed to be mixed with at least 50 or 60 kinds of powerful medicinal herbs. This medicinal smell came from a man sitting on a rattan chair in front of the pond. Most of his body was wrapped in thick bandages. It seemed that he could barely maintain his human form with the help of these bandages. He could barely sit there and look at Ding Ning and Jing Liuli. Jing Liuli's eyes unconsciously narrowed, not because of the medicinal smell, but because of this person's status and respect. She knew this person was Feng Xiang. The Feng Xiang who had played an important role in the Deer Mountain Conference, but whose meridians were all broken. Please sit. This marquis, who had once dominated the world, but was now paler than Wang Taishu at his weakest, looked up slightly at Ding Ning and Jing Liuli, who were walking into the courtyard. His head was the only part he could move right now. Ding Ning bowed seriously to him and then sat down on the rattan chair in front of him. There was another rattan chair next to him, clearly prepared for Jing Liuli. But Jing Liuli did not sit and stood respectfully behind Ding Ning with her head bowed. Looking at this scene, the admiration in Feng Xiang's eyes grew stronger. Why do you know the Feng family's borrowing sword essence? However, his words were very direct, and there was no transition at all when he asked such a question. Ding Ning looked into his eyes and said directly, Feng Shimu came to Falling Parasol to see me. Jing Liuli immediately frowned. This may be a detail that Min Mountain Sword sect had overlooked. She clearly remembered that there was no such record in the record she had seen. Feng Xiang looked at Ding Ning and did not say anything. Then he suddenly laughed. So my brother passed it to you, even though you were not a cultivator back then? Ding Ning looked calmly at his eyes and smiled, and did not answer. Feng Xiang continued. So as long as I can confirm that this matter is true, then perhaps I will think that your current progress in cultivation is related to my brother, because it can also be said that from then on, you were already my brother's direct disciple. Jing Liuli's eyebrows slowly rose. She felt that Feng Xiang's words were very offensive. But Ding Ning only listened calmly and did not respond. My brother will know if this matter is true when he comes back and asks. Feng Xiang looked at Ding Ning and said. Ding Ning glanced at him and said, maybe he will never return to Chongling, or maybe you will not be here when he returns. Hearing such an answer, Feng Xiang's smile faded, but he was not angry. He looked seriously at Ding Ning and said, as long as you believe that from that day on, my brother taught you the method to cultivate, you will not be angry. Then this matter will always be true. Jing Liuli stilled. She had not expected Feng Xiang to say such a thing. Ding Ning did not immediately answer. He looked up again and looked at Feng Xiang, who seemed to have shrunk in size. He said seriously, the result may be terrible. Feng Xiang smiled self-deprecatingly and looked down at himself. How much worse can it be? Ding Ning looked at him and nodded. He did not say anything else. My gift to you will be in the carriage. Feng Xiang did not seem to have any more energy to waste. He said with a lowered head. Ding Ning looked at him and narrowed his eyes slightly. He had some new ideas in his mind, but he did not say anything. He just stood up, bowed, and turned to leave. The carriage was the same one that had brought them here, but there was a black metal box on the cushioned seat. Ding Ning opened this unlocked metal box. There was a thin book inside. What did he give you? Jing Liuli could not help but ask softly. Some other secret swords of Feng Ho province, and some of his and Feng Shimu's experiences on methods and sword moves, Ding Ning said without looking up. Jing Liuli stilled. Then she finally understood the meaning of the two's conversation. After a few breaths, she understood more. She turned to look at Ding Ning. When you challenged Daoist Qian, did you use that borrowing sword essence to purposefully create such a situation? Was this part of your plan from the start? Or rather, you had many ways to kill Daoist Qian, but among those methods, you deliberately chose to use this borrowing sword essence as the opening? There are not so many coincidences in the world. Ding Ning glanced at her and said. Then he slowly said, I only know that Fenghe province must regret not choosing me in the past. Jing Lioli was silent for a moment and said, The details of the plan are perfect. Ding Ning did not look at her and continued to read the thin book in his hand. He said softly, I must quickly understand many things inside. When I face Palace Attendant Rome, I must use some of the things inside to kill her. This book did not reach my hands today, but the day Feng Shimu came to see me. So I need to appear familiar with some of the things inside. Chapter 382. In this drama of midsummer, there seemed to be more and more interesting plots. That trusted palace attendant of the Empress, who had always lived in seclusion, had a secret lover in an ordinary tea garden. The wine shop youth that everyone thought had no background actually seemed to be inextricably linked to the Feng Marquis estate. Some news would spread very quickly if it was deliberately spread. Soon, more than half of Chongling knew the truth. Many of Ding Ning's neighbors who lived in Falling Parasol at the time confirmed it. Before Ding Ning entered White Goat Cave to cultivate, Feng Shimu had interacted with Ding Ning. In the investigation files of the Divinity Bureau back then, it only stated that Feng Shimu had come to Falling Parasol to see Ding Ning. But who knew if Feng Shimu's seeing was just on the surface or something he had done in secret? Ever since the Yuanwu Emperor indicated for Feng Shimu to follow before the Deer Mountain Conference and Feng Shimu left Chongling, many powerful cultivators of Chongling started to feel that the strongest person in Fenghe Province was not Feng Xiang, but the cultivation maniac of Fenghe Province, Feng Shimu. Did Feng Shimu really teach him something? But I feel it is not so. But if not, how can he explain the borrowing sword essence of Fenghe Province? Xie Chongqing stood in front of the green window and muttered to himself in confusion. Then he could not help but turn to look at the middle-aged cultivator in green robes standing behind him. This middle-aged cultivator looked back at him speechlessly. He thought, You are Ding Ning's best friend. If you do not understand, how can I understand? He actually wants me to do something like this. It seems his battle with Palace Attendant Rong is coming soon. Unable to get an answer, Xie Chongqing sighed and stretched his right hand out of the window. Shreds of paper flew from his fingertips like snow. It's a pity that I'm still heavily injured, so I can't watch your battle with my own eyes. Hearing Xie Chongqing's first words, the eyes of the middle-aged cultivator dressed in Min Mountain Sword Sect's indigo robes flashed with hope. But when he heard Xie Chongqing's next words, even though he was used to great storms, he could not help but gape. How could there be such a shameless person in the world? Seriously injured? How could his injuries be serious? He had shamelessly stayed in Min Mountain Sword Sect for so long, wanted to secretly learn from them every day, and he still wanted to stay? Thinking of what a certain sect uncle had said, that being so thick-skinned was a skill, this middle-aged cultivator could not help but shake his head. He did not feel any anger, but frowned slightly. You are one of Ding Ning's best friends. Since you feel that his duel with Palace Attendant Rong is near, do you really not want to come out of Min Mountain Sword Sect to watch? He originally wanted to say, with your shamelessness, even if you left Min Mountain Sword Sect, you could find an excuse to come back. Even Sect Master Bailey seemed to have tacitly approved of you. But thinking that it was inappropriate to say such words, he didn't say them out loud in the end. Xie Chongqing had interacted with the Min Mountain Sword Sect teachers in this hall for a long time and was familiar with their personalities. He had guessed what he was going to say, but he smiled and did not blush at all. He said matter-of-factly, I am not worried. In any case, it will end with Ding Ning winning. I am not even interested in betting in the underground gambling houses for such a matter without any suspense. This Min Mountain Sword Sect teacher who admired Ding Ning was slightly worried and said, The difference in cultivation is too great. Xie Chongqing glanced sideways at him and said, "This matter is harder than winning the Min Mountain Sword trials? Harder than forcing that palace attendant to this extent? Harder than inexplicably cultivating for such a short time and almost reaching Realm 5? Hearing Xie Chongqing's rapid words, this Min Mountain Sword sect teacher stilled and immediately felt it was reasonable. Xie Chongqing turned to look out the window at the Min Mountain Sword sect cultivators practicing the sword in the valley. He smiled proudly and said, also, this person had no obstacles in his previous breakthroughs. If you tell me now that he went from Realm 4 to Realm 5 and completed his breakthrough in the blink of an eye, I will not be shocked." This middle-aged Min Mountain Sword sect teacher paled. Following these words, he unconsciously thought, if there were no obstacles in a breakthrough, then such a cultivator was too terrifying. There had never been one in the history books, Chongling, and even the entire Qin dynasty in the world. For all cultivators, the time taken to break through was always more than the time taken to cultivate in the previous realm. Because the true difficulty was always to explore the invisible world ahead, to sense the rules of an unfamiliar world, to sense the unknown energy world, and not the accumulation of physical strength and vital energy. Dripping water could penetrate stone. This was something that all stupid people would do. What determined some people to be above Realm 7 and others to stay in Realm 3 and 4 for their entire lives was the ability to discover new worlds. If a new world could be seen at a glance without any obstacles, what kind of genius was that? What kind of realm could he reach in the end? The more this Min Mountain Sword sect teacher thought, the more terrifying and incredulous he felt. His body started to tremble. With a buzzing sound, a sword light shone from the top of his head, illuminating the entire green room with an emerald green hue. Xie Chongqing's reply had been sent back to Chongling. When the Guanzhong Xie family started to move again, many Chongling people who sensed this tensed up again. These people felt that this matter was about to end. If Palace Attendant Rong did not die, then Ding Ning of Ink Garden would die. But even though Ding Ning had done so many things, humiliated Palace Attendant Rong, and made her truly alone, Palace Attendant Rong still lived deep in the Imperial Palace. Even those things did not force Palace Attendant Rong out. Then what method did Ding Ning have to force Palace Attendant Rong out of the palace? Jing Liuli's most important matter in Chongling these days was to observe Ding Ning. She knew better than Xie Chongqing that the curtain was about to fall on this great show. Especially this morning, when Ding Ning did not cultivate in his little courtyard, but walked towards the highest hill in Ink Garden with an aura that she found unfamiliar. But she could not think of where the straw that broke the camel's back was. Ding Ning came to the top of the hill that was Ink Garden. There was a pavilion high up. Back then, the patriarch of the Zhou family and Shui Wangshu had drunk tea here. Ding Ning looked at the table where the tea table should have been and was silent for a long time. Then he walked out of the pavilion to the front platform. He looked down at all of Ink Garden and then in the direction of the Imperial Palace. In reality, some matters are not as complicated as imagined. He turned to look at Jing Liuli, who was following behind him, and slowly said, "When I thought it through, I felt it was so simple. When I did not, I felt there was no solution. The straw that broke the camel's back came from myself." After saying this, he raised his head and looked up at the sky. Jing Liuli suddenly sensed something. While she knew something like this could happen, in this moment, her face turned ashen and her breathing stopped. A fresh presence spread out of Ding Ning's body and flowed down the hill like mercury. Primal energies of the universe cheerfully came from the sky and gathered into Ding Ning's body. Ding Ning's body boomed. His eyes seemed to grow several times brighter. A white cloud energy strangely appeared above this little hill like the tail of a white fairy. Many people outside Ink Garden saw this and felt shock and disbelief. But this was just the beginning. The last flower remnant sword at Ding Ning's waist started to light up. Ding Ning's hand did not move. He did not remove the sword hilt, but countless fine white flowers started to bloom on the last flower remnant sword. Then, the broken sword flew up into the air without any hindrance. Many fine flowers fell from the sky. Many people saw the sword light that soared into the sky, full of unyielding sword will. This sword light charged into the white clouds above. There was a soft pop. It was like a bubble had burst. He has a breakthrough. Without needing to think, this word appeared in many people's minds. Then there was a roar like a boulder rolling down a mountain. Then there was thunder and drums. Then the white clouds turned into black clouds. Then the sky was wet. Jing Lioli's breathing still stopped as she looked at the sky. An ink scroll seemed to have been pulled open in the sky. The entire sky seemed to have turned into an ink scroll. Countless lines of rain started to fall. Even the lines of rain were black and white. Countless people looked up in shock at the scene above Ink Garden. In the scene, the sword light was still flashing and flying through the lines of rain. That was a flying sword. Ding Ning's flying sword. Realm 5. Ding Ning has reached Realm 5. He can control a flying sword after reaching Realm 5. Why is it like this? Soft voices gathered into a flood and even reached Jing Lioli's ears in Ink Garden. Jing Lioli started to have difficulty breathing. She finally understood what the last straw was. Ding Ning's breakthrough. Ding Ning's performance was the straw that broke Palace Attendant Rong's last line of defense. Chapter 383. The black and white rain shrouded all of Ink Garden unrealistically. In the different streets of Chongling, many young geniuses looked up at the rain, their eyes filled with a kind of fanatical worship. In a distant turret that appeared blinding and white in the sunlight, Huang Jinwei and Mo Shouqing's eyes were filled with emotion and shock. The old man, whose hair fluttered like ginseng whiskers, withdrew his gaze from the black and white rain and looked at the nearby streets. He seemed to catch the fanatical gazes of these young people and sighed softly. Just like in the past, Huang Jinwei's breathing paused slightly. He knew the meaning of Mo Shouqing's words. Only when that person appeared out of nowhere and competed in Chongling would such a gaze appear in the eyes of all the young people in Chongling. Ever since that person died, the young people of Chongling never had such a look in their eyes again. Huang Jinwei and the old man who actually controlled all the turrets were not the only ones looking at the rain from the turret. In the cultivation grounds of the Chongling Imperial Palace, the master of Endless Palace, Pan Rui, was also looking at Ink Garden from a turret. She had always admired Ding Ning. In the countless dynasties of the past, in the records of the cultivation world, the fastest record was Realm 5 in 3 years. Ding Ning had a breakthrough at such a speed, and used his flying sword to display the sword essences of the Ink Garden Remnant Scroll. This undoubtedly refreshed the knowledge of all cultivators, and broke the record of the cultivation world. But today, when she saw the rain in Ink Garden, for some reason, she did not feel any joy. She knew that some things would have an outcome, but she could not help but think that maybe Palace Attendant Rong's outcome, no matter if it was good or bad, it could be her own outcome in the future. There were many small hills outside Ink Garden that were not close. One of the hills was located within a very large mansion. At this time, in a pavilion on this small hill, there was a figure like a mountain of flesh. Only Mount Hung Marquis, Su could give people the feeling of a mountain with such a fat figure. Of the 13 marquises of the Qin dynasty, only a few would often live in Chongling, and Mount Hung Marquis Su almost never left Chongling. Is a palace made more important than the whole world? The mountain-like figure swayed a little, as if he was shaking his head with a sigh. The entire hill seemed to tremble along with his body. Bai Shanshui and Yi Xiling were also looking in the direction of Ink Garden. The two of them were the most sensitive to Chongling's water energy. At this time, they knew the cause of the change in the air above Ink Garden. This is really a good rain. Bai Shanshui couldn't help but laugh. Countless people looked in the direction of Ink Garden. For many people who did not belong to Chongling and the Qin dynasty, this black and white rain did not just mean a new record in the cultivation world. It also meant that the situation of the world would change completely in the future. This rain only covered the Zhou family Ink Garden, yet it also seemed to cover all of Chongling, and the world. In the imperial palace of Chongling, Empress Zhengxiu stood in front of several spirit lotuses that had fallen off their petals and had small seed heads. She was silent, but starlight that could not be seen during the day fell down from the well in front of her. It grew brighter and formed more and more indescribably beautiful and cold flames around her. In the imperial palace that was not far from her, but seemed to be very far away due to the many courtyards, the Yuanwu emperor, dressed in cloth robes, also looked up in the direction of Ink Garden. His gaze was blocked by layers of palaces, but black and white light reflected in the depths of his eyes. Such a miracle! The most powerful emperor in the world was also slightly startled. Then, he let out a heartfelt sigh of admiration. In the camp of the tiger and wolf army, Liang Lian heard the strange sound of arrows. He started to walk out of the camp, and out of the camp, Palace attendant Rome stood under the yellow eaves. She could not see Ink Garden, but she knew that a black and white rain had fallen in Ink Garden. She knew that a sword light had flown out of Ink Garden. After Zhang Liang left Chongling, she had stood stiffly under the eaves for a long time each day, looking dazedly in the direction of the tea garden like a clay figurine. At this time, her head finally started to turn. She looked at the surrounding walls, and then at the imperial palace walls further away. She suddenly laughed. He laughed miserably. This place really is like a prison cell. In my life, I have never lived a day for myself. If I can kill you, I will kill you. The yellow-robed middle-aged cultivator, who often walked through the imperial palace, walked from the emperor's study towards palace attendant Rong's courtyard. His steps were the same as usual. I have never lived a day for myself. If there is a chance, I will live a day for myself. I think you were the same. When he reached palace attendant Rong's courtyard, he thought inside. A hint of a smile appeared at the corners of his mouth. It was not a tragic smile, but a strange smile with a heroic presence and anticipation. Then he pushed open the half-closed door and walked in. He had been slightly bent, but he quickly straightened. The courtyard was empty. There was no sign of palace attendant Rong. Palace attendant Rong was no longer present. At this time, she was passing through a side hall and walking towards the side palace door that she usually used to leave the palace. Most people in the imperial palace learned of Ink Garden much later than palace attendant Rong. Many palace attendants and guards along the way saw her, but were only surprised. They did not understand why she, who had decided to stay in the imperial palace, would walk out. She did not stop. Just like usual, no one dared to stop her. Before many people could react, she left the palace gates and walked into the streets of Chongling. This black and white rain did not last long. When the fine white flowers disappeared in the air, the last flower remnant sword landed with a slight hum next to Ding Ning. Ding Ning looked at the last flower remnant sword that seemed to tremble in excitement. He felt very satisfied. "Let's go," he said softly to Jing Lioli. "Don't drive." Jing Lioli instinctively prepared a carriage. But when she saw Ding Ning walk out of his little courtyard, he did not walk towards the carriage she had prepared. He shook his head at her and walked out. Then she saw the long worm that Ding Ning had stuffed into the long box on his back. She stilled. "Why is this worm like this?" Ding Ning turned to look at her and said, "You will know in the future." Jing Lioli had predicted this answer before he spoke, so she naturally pressed her lips together and did not speak. Ding Ning walked out of Ink Garden. Outside Ink Garden, Yi Jingnan stood with his head bowed. Previously, each time Jing Lioli and Ding Ning left Ink Garden, he would only watch as they left. He organized everything in Ink Garden like a true handyman. But today, when he saw Ding Ning's figure walk out, he naturally followed. He followed Jing Lioli and was dozens of feet away from Jing Lioli. When he saw Ding Ning's back, his heart trembled even more. Ding Ning carried an enormous black metal box on his back. Many swordsmen in Chongling liked to carry sword boxes to hide their long swords. But no sword box was so large. But even though he did not know, he was certain that Ding Ning's departure today was completely different from usual. Ding Ning also walked into the streets of Chongling. While countless people's gazes were gathered on him, he was familiar with the streets of Chongling, and moved quickly through the alleys. So he, Jing Lioli, and Yi Jingnan quickly disappeared from the sight of most people. The shock was still spreading through Chongling. What followed was the news that palace attendant Rong and Ding Ning had left the Imperial Palace and Ink Garden respectively. Then more and more people in Chongling learned that palace attendant Rong and Ding Ning had walked separately into the streets of Chongling. They did not know where they were going or where they would meet. Chapter 384. Palace attendant Rong walked quickly. She casually passed through a farm and changed her robes. Usually, it was easy for her to find the tracks of a person in Chongling, but it was difficult for other people to find her as long as she was fast enough. So when she kept walking, almost everyone was just a step behind her, and only knew where she had gone. She passed through a deserted courtyard. There had been a tall stage outside the courtyard. Now, the top of the stage was gone. The stairs of the stage had rotted, and the stage was covered in broken tiles and weeds. She saw that person and his brothers here. She admired them and wanted to become one of them. Then she finally had a chance to become a retainer of the Jiaodong Commandery Zheng family and the personal attendant of that perfect woman from Jiaodong Commandery. She walked past the stage and through a horse farm. The horse farm was deserted, and the weeds were growing very vigorously. There was a mass graveyard on the distant river port. She remembered that she had done the first thing she was unwilling to do here. She had purposefully delayed a military order and caused a person to die in battle. That person had been one of the people from the Bazin Kendo ground that she had admired. She did not stop. Her figure quickly appeared in a forest of apricot trees. There were 2 small bridges at the end of this forest, facing in 2 different directions. She walked across one of the bridges. These were the 2 bridges she had walked across in the past. After crossing this bridge, she found that she was further and further away from the person she wanted to be, and in the end, she became someone she did not like. She took a detour and arrived at a bustling market. This place was filled with shops that sold goods from the north and south. They used bamboo poles to hold up shading cloths. Even in the summer, it was very busy, giving off the smell of salted fish, salted meat, and seasonings. The thick stench could not mask the scent of blood that entered her mind. She thought of the day 3 years before the Yuanwu emperor ascended the throne. This was a millstone of blood and flesh. Countless flying swords in the sky were easily snapped like arrows and fell into the thick, bloody mud. The corpses of Realm 4 and 5 cultivators were piled up like ordinary soldiers. All the buildings here had been reduced to dust. Every sword light brought with it mountainous waves of blood and over 100 pieces of corpses flying in all directions, like a giant boat moving in the waves. Most of the people she had seen on the stage had died here. She watched from afar. She didn't know if she felt lucky or afraid. She couldn't stand up. She sat on the ground and trembled. Eventually, her body became cold. After that, she became cold and unfeeling. She followed the young miss from Jiaodong Commandery back then and never felt terror. She knew that she had completely become the Empress Shadow. Palace attendant Rong looked at her own shadow. The shadow was very lonely. There was only one shadow. She had already walked along the riverbank and was not far from the tea garden. Back then, she had walked here coldly and blankly and met that serene tea master. He did not know her identity and only thought that she was a student of a cultivation place who had lost her way here, or a lucky survivor of a family in Chongling. He took her in, but why was he not here in the end? She ignored the mud and sat down on the riverbank facing the tea garden. She hugged her head and started to tremble like she had that day when she saw the mountain of corpses. She felt as though she had returned to that time. She didn't know why, but her mind was as clear as before. She thought of all the things Ding Ning had done to her. She thought of everything that had happened in the last few days. She felt a sense of familiarity, but she thought of all the places she had walked just now and the 2 bridges. She quickly stood up again. She walked towards the streets of Chongling and started to search for Ding Ning, who was moving through Chongling. Jing Lioli followed quietly behind Ding Ning like a servant girl. Yi Jingnan followed quietly behind Ding Ning. Ding Ning moved through the streets faster than palace attendant Rome, and he would take many shortcuts. But he would also make some short stops in some places. The first place he stopped was a nameless alley. There was a broken stone stele next to an ordinary farmer's yard covered in moss. Ding Ning stopped and opened the metal box on his back. As the sword essence flowed out of the metal box, the moss on the stone stele lost a patch, revealing a neat cut. Then an almost indiscernible sword essence returned to Ding Ning's metal box like a current of air. Jing Lioli and Yi Jingnan's breathing suddenly stopped. They sensed that faint and unfathomable sword essence. Their instincts told them that they could not understand. It only meant that it was too high and not on the same level. But Ding Ning's actions allowed them to understand what Ding Ning was doing, especially Jing Lioli. She could not believe that Ding Ning could master such a sword manual in such a short time. Ding Ning continued to walk through the streets. He walked past a patch of mottled ancient walls. Some of the white dust on the ancient walls had fallen off, revealing some marks that people would not be able to see even if they came later. He walked past a wide stone path where many carriages and horses traveled. Some dust shot out of the cracks in the stone ground. He walked past a vegetable garden. In the storm last summer, when Yi Sealing returned and fought with Zhao Zhan of the Zhao Sword Furnace, a wave of sword energy had destroyed this vegetable garden. Other than Jing Lioli and Yi Jingnan, even some of the cultivators who had been following him could not sense this presence because they were not close enough. In the eyes of all of them, Ding Ning had ultimately chosen a very shortcut and walked towards a guild hall. That meeting hall was called Hanging Pot Hall. It was a very large medical hall. Of all the medical halls in Chongling, it was the second best medical hall. As Ding Ning appeared in front of this medical hall, many people realized that this medical hall had been reserved by the Guanzhong Xie family. The master of Hanging Pot Hall, Sun Xingtong, was one of the most famous doctors in Chongling. He was from Guanzhong. When Ding Ning came to the gates of Hanging Pot Hall, this old man in his 70s was already waiting in front of the door. "You have entered Realm 5. Looking at Ding Ning, who greeted him calmly, the old man returned the greeting and said slowly with unusual solemnity, "There has never been a cultivator who entered Realm 5 so quickly, so you cannot have any mishaps. I understand your meaning." Ding Ning smiled and said, "You hope that I will not be in a hurry. But if people always think that they cannot be in a hurry, they will be slow. Maybe in the future, it will be a different person." The old man stilled slightly and then bowed seriously. "I do not understand cultivation as well as you, but your words make me feel that they are reasonable." Ding Ning bowed again and returned the greeting. "Thank you for your trouble, elder." The old man nodded and returned to the medical hall that had been bustling in the past but was very quiet today. Most of the doctors had been dismissed. Ding Ning stopped. He put down the metal box on his back and simply put it behind his back. Then he stood silently at the door of the medical hall and looked at the road ahead. Seeing him stop completely, everyone started to understand that he was waiting here for palace attendant Rome. Jing Lioli and Yi Zhengnan exchanged a look. They were even more certain that Ding Ning would not leave after stopping here. So the two of them walked behind Ding Ning, in the shadows behind the door of Hanging Pot Hall. Thunder inexplicably roared in the sky. There were no black clouds, but it seemed like someone was beating the drums for the upcoming show. There were no black clouds in the sky, but a patch of black clouds floated out of the alley on the side. Everyone on that side fearfully surged in another direction. Many people in Chongling would use umbrellas to block the sun, but no one's umbrella would be so black. Looking at the densely packed black umbrellas, everyone knew that the bureau chief of the astrology bureau, Yi Sealing, had arrived. There was a stone bridge not far from the guild hall. A carriage stopped by the stone bridge. The carriage was ordinary, but it had a dark and moldy presence that caused many cultivators to not dare to pass by. Only the commoners didn't notice it, and the crowd surged toward the guild hall. Looking down from the high turrets, there were countless people in the alleys of Chongling moving towards the hall like ants. Huang Jinwei, who had just stepped onto the turret closest to the hall, had a gaze full of worry and admiration. It had been many years since such a scene had appeared, but at the same time, he was slightly stunned, because his teacher, Imo Shoching, had not come. He did not know the reason. Chapter 385. The bureau chief of the Astrology Bureau, Yi Sealing, had arrived. The chief inspector Chun of the Divinity Bureau had also arrived. He even saw a carriage belonging to the Fong Marquis estate. Inside should be Fong Xiang, whose cultivation was crippled. There were many important people mixed in the crowd, including many peerless experts of Min Mountain Sword sect. But Mo Shoucheng, who had been paying close attention to Ding Ning and had not missed any of Ding Ning's battles, did not appear. Huang Jinwei did not understand. He even started to worry that something was wrong with Mo Shoucheng's body. More and more people flooded towards the alley where Ding Ning was. The center of gravity of all of Chongling seemed to be leaning towards this place. Not just because Ding Ning was the winner of the Min Mountain Sword Trials, not just because this was a great show with enough foreplay, but even more importantly, this was a battle of realms. In the memories of many Chongling cultivators, even that person had only said that there was no difference between Realms 4 and below. But now, Ding Ning was Realm 5, and that palace attendant Realm was Realm 6. If a Realm 5 could defeat a Realm 6, this was enough to change everyone's understanding. The path in front of Ding Ning was completely blocked. However, the people holding black umbrellas had surrounded the empty space in front of the clinic where the carriages were parked. Thus, the space in front of Ding Ning still appeared empty. There was an unusual disturbance in the crowd. The black umbrellas suddenly parted to let a young person, who looked slightly older than Ding Ning, walk in. Ding Ning smiled warmly and then bowed slightly to this person. This person was Su Hashan. After greeting Ding Ning, he said seriously, "They are still studying in Min Mountain Sword sect, so I am here." Hearing this, Jing Liuli's eyebrows rose slightly. She knew that the they Su Hashan spoke of were Xie Chongxing and the other friends of Ding Ning. Su Hashan was their representative. While only Su Hashan had come, his words meant that these young people were still on Ding Ning's side. Thunder roared in the sky. The weather was hot, and many people were gathered together. Many people found it difficult to bear the heat and almost fainted. Strange ripples appeared in the crowd in the distance. Many people cried out in surprise, which made people feel refreshed. A woman with a cold expression, dressed in the robes of an ordinary peasant woman, slowly passed through the crowd. Most people did not recognize this woman, but looking at the reactions and gazes of the surrounding people, and sensing the unusual presence this woman gave off, everyone knew that this woman was that palace attendant Rome. Because of her unique identity, the significance of this battle, and the special aura she was emitting at this moment. Although the crowd on both sides was already very congested, they still unconsciously moved to the sides to avoid her. The crowd in front of her parted like the tide, and the road became even wider. Most people wanted to see the result of this battle, yet some people did not want to see this battle occur. A middle-aged man dressed in ordinary robes did not move aside. Looking at palace attendant Rong, who came close to him, he nodded slightly and said softly, "Please do not be like this. I think the Empress does not want this." Does not want this, and then? Palace attendant Rong looked expressionlessly at the middle-aged man and walked past him. The middle-aged man stilled and did not know what palace attendant Rong meant. Palace attendant Rong's cold voice reached his ears. "Then wait for him to reach realm 6 or 7, and then kill me? Then all I can do is wait in the imperial palace for the day he comes to kill me?" The middle-aged man could not answer. For him, when he mentioned the Empress, palace attendant Rong did not turn her head. He could not answer. After this, no one stopped her. The streets and alleys went from noisy to silent. Even those people who felt they were about to faint from the heat started to have patience. Palace attendant Rong walked to the edge of the black umbrella. The shadow of the black umbrella covered her face and made it impossible to see her emotions. Then the black umbrella parted. She walked over and appeared in Ding Ning's sight. Ding Ning looked calmly at palace attendant Rong, who was coming closer, and said coldly, "I want to challenge you." His voice was not loud at this time, but it seemed to spread to all the streets and alleys in this area, causing many people to tremble. Palace attendant Rong slowly looked up. She looked silently at Ding Ning, the blood on her lips growing. Then she shook her head and said, "This time, it is not you who wants to challenge me, but I want to challenge you." The sound of heavy breathing could be heard from the sea of people around them. Many people had guessed what the two of them would say when they finally met here, but no one had guessed that it would be like this at the beginning. While many people were still shocked, speechless, Ding Ning smiled in satisfaction. "I accept your challenge." Then he put away his smile and said seriously to Palace Attendant Rome. Palace Attendant Rome looked at him, her expression strange. Then she said, "He did not leave behind the words in the tea garden. You speak of the row of white bone words?" Ding Ning looked coolly at Palace Attendant Rong and said, "If he did not leave it, he may have told others. Even more importantly, no one knows what that date represents. Also, is there any meaning in saying this now?" Before Palace Attendant Rong could speak, Ding Ning said disdainfully, "If you die, everything will end." Palace Attendant Rong laughed. She had not laughed like this for a long time, so her smile was especially strange and bleak. "You think I am afraid of death, so I have to come out and fight you?" She shook her head and said softly, "You are wrong. I just want to atone for my sins, since everything is in the past, and there is no meaning. Then the only one I need to atone for is Zhang Liyang." Ding Ning was silent for a moment and said, "Only when a person is about to die will they have such thoughts and think of so many meaningless things." Palace Attendant Rong's expression recovered its indifference and then flashed with a porcelain-like light. "I want you to die in front of me." Ding Ning laughed. "Then you can try. Since it is a battle to the death, what are you waiting for?" Palace Attendant Rong looked up again with slight disdain at Ding Ning and said slowly. A wave of vitality spread out from her body. The dust on the stone path beneath her began to spurt out like a fountain. Because this was her own choice. Because she wanted to live for herself today, she needed to start the battle as soon as possible. A black-robed man wearing a bamboo hat stopped. He was not far from the tea garden where Zhang Liyang resided. Ding Ning and Palace Attendant Rong were very far from the tea garden, but the news he had received before was that he could stop Palace Attendant Rong here. But now, the latest news that came to him told him that there was a problem with the information that had been sent to him before. At least there was a great problem with the timing. Even if he was faster, he could not stop Palace Attendant Rong here. Then who had the power to change the information that was sent to him? Actually, Zheng Xiao is best at giving false military orders and purposefully delaying the transmission of information. Just as the black-clothed man stopped, a woman's voice with a unique and untamed aura came from the river and entered his ears. A black sword silently appeared around him, as if it had a life of its own, and began to move around. The black-robed man thought. His eyes suddenly lit up in the shadow of the bamboo hat. He said in disbelief, "By Shan Shui, Blue Sea Tide is clearly the most majestic and beautiful sword essence." But after following Zheng Xiao, such a sword manual was cultivated into the ghostly energy of a dream. What a pity. Bai Shan Shui stepped onto the river and looked down at the man. She shook her head with a hint of disdain. The black-robed man laughed. He laughed so hard that the bamboo hat on his head shattered into countless threads. "Bai Shan Shui, what gives you the confidence to challenge me?" Hearing his words, Bai Shan Shui also laughed. She looked arrogantly at the handsome man and said, "In reality, you should be more concerned about why I am attacking you." Su Fanqin stilled and then laughed. Life and death is the most important matter. Why care about anything else at this time? Bai Shan Shui looked up at the sky in satisfaction and said, "Today, Zheng Xiao lost two important people. I wonder if she will feel pain." You're tuning in to the Warrior Lore YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.